And Chair, we're live.
Thank you and welcome everybody to the March 18th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. If we can have a roll call, please.
Yes, Chair Gutierrez,
Here.
Vice Chair Hogan,
Here.
Secretary Clow,
Here.
Commissioner Chavez,
Here.
Commissioner Faulkner,
Here.
Commissioner Garcia, Commissioner Lawrence,
Here.
Commissioner Picarello,
Here.
Commissioner Satania.
Here.
Mr. Chair, a quorum is present.
Thank you. Following up the Pledge of Allegiance, Secretary Clow, if you would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next, approval of the agenda. Any changes from staff?
Chair, staff has no changes.
Any changes from the commission? Hearing none, if I could get a motion.
Commissioner Hogan, motions to approve the agenda.
Faulkner to second.
Thank you. If we can have a roll call, please.
Yes, Commissioner Chavez,
Yes.
Commissioner Clow,
Yes.
Commissioner Faulkner,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hogan,
Yes.
Commissioner Lawrence,
Yes.
Commissioner Picarello,
Yes.
Commissioner Satania.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. Moving on, we have no minutes to approve, so we'll be at approval of findings, conclusions of fact, case number 2020-2999, 4250 Cerrillos Road. If I can get a motion, please.
I would like to move to, this is Commissioner Clow, and I'd like to move to postpone the approval or denial of the minutes because at our next meeting on April 1st, I would like to make a motion to rescind the vote on that matter. And the reason, I know we're been advised by the our city attorney not to discuss the matter, but it was okay to sort of explain it a little bit. And you know, it felt a little odd when we were doing it, and it took me a while to sort of sort through it. But I really think the appropriate thing for us to have done was to vote approval conditioned on all, subject to all of the conditions, including staff's recommendation on the sidewalk and the parking, rather than deny it. And so I'd like us to basically hold off on the findings and to, at our April 1st meeting, to first consider a motion to rescind.
Okay. Do I have a second?
I'll second the motion to postpone.
Thank you. Any discussion, commissioners?
I mean, aren't these the findings and facts now? And if we rescinded them, wouldn't it then we would do a different findings and facts?
Well, what we're doing is just postponing the vote on the findings. And then at the next meeting on April 1, it'll be on the agenda that a motion to rescind is going to be considered. And then at that point in time, if there's agreement that we can consider the motion to rescind, then there'll be, it'll open it back up again.
And I'm not sure that I can even, one question I had is, I wasn't at the meeting, so I'm not even sure I can vote on this.
Mr. Prince, two quick questions. The one of Commissioner Faulkner and Commissioner Chavez were both absent at the meeting for the minutes in question. And the second question is, do we need to postpone these to a date certain, or is it okay just for postponement on the?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Chair Gutierrez. commissioners. So in regards to the first question, I guess, of the, I guess 2 commissioners were not present at the last meeting, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
And can they now vote to, well, either approve the findings of facts and conclusions of law or not, or I guess, is that the question that you're asking now?
Yes, do we include them or do we exclude them because they weren't at the meeting where these findings and facts were relevant from?
Chair, this is Noah. If I would, the proper way is if you were not at the meeting, you would abstain from the vote. You'd abstain. And city attorney can correct me if I'm wrong with that.
No, I believe that's correct, Noah. I could try to verify that. I'm not highly familiar with some of these procedures, but I believe that is correct, that you would have to abstain from the vote to approve or disapprove.
But could they, I mean, could they vote on the motion to postpone the findings?
Good question. Commissioner Clow, I believe they could.
I would think so.
Yeah, I can't really. Yeah, I believe that's fine for them to vote on that matter of postponing or not postponing. And that's all that's before the commission at the moment.
Thank you. I have 2 hands up and I don't know how they came up. So Vice Chair Hogan and Commissioner Setenia. Commissioner Setenia, on my computer, you're first, so go ahead.
I understand what's being proposed, but I also see what was missing in the last meeting is us actually stating the criteria for why we voted the way we did. And I didn't know if anyone actually, or if Vice Chair Hogan wanted to speak to that before we consider the motion, at hand, which is to rescind a vote and reconsidering voting for it. So I just want to throw that out there.
Thank you, Commissioner Setenia. Vice Chair Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that we could have been more succinct in stating the causes for denial, although I do think the conversation was pretty clear in establishing what the concerns were. So anyway, I'm not sure on the findings issue in terms of postponement. And this, I guess, the question for the assistant attorney, but wouldn't we establish or vote on the findings from one meeting, and then based on what grounds we would decide to open up the conversation, reconsider, which would generate a whole new set of findings and represent what factual content was being put on the record. So I guess that's just a question of whether or not a postponement is the right thing to do,
Can I just interject that I consulted with Sally and she responded to me and told me sort of how to proceed. And she basically said that she recommended postpone the findings, a vote on the findings, and that at the next meeting that it be put on the agenda. And I think Jennifer Jenkins is aware of this and would be present at the next meeting, and that we would then address the issue of a motion to reconsider, or motion to rescind and then reconsider.
Mr. Chairman, if I could continue. Also, I was going to let you know actually that I will be absent at that next meeting, and so I don't know that affects any of this, but in terms of what we will make sure that is stated in the record, I won't be in attendance. Anyway, I'm not sure I got an answer from the attorney's office.
Yes, Vice Chair Hogan. if I understand, you kind of were asking about whether just to approve the finding of facts and conclusions of law, and then later re-examining that, or doing it more as the as Commissioner Clow is presenting tonight to vote on basically not basically vote on postponing the approval or denial tonight. I'm not bringing it up. Either way, I think is fine. I think either way would be permissible under the rules. It might be more. It might be easier to do it the way Commissioner Cloud is doing it in a sense. Coming back, otherwise you have to. I mean, if the findings of facts and conclusions of law are rescinded, let's say at the next meeting, there would be a rewrite or amendment of whatever was changed in that document, which is probably an easier rewrite. Maybe I can't say for sure. Than maybe a complete rewrite of the findings of facts and conclusions of law. I mean, I hope I'm not being too confusing, but I think either way, I think would be permissible.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll just one comment on that, and then I'll yield the floor. But in my opinion, I think we ought to establish the facts in terms of why we denied the project, and then establish the facts on why we would rescind the denial and open it back up again. And I think both of those should be captured in not only the meeting minutes, but the findings as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hogan. And just adding a little bit on Secretary Clow and the attorneys, I think it just, in Sally's mind, made for a cleaner record and project if it was delayed until we see where this motion to rescind lands. I think that was the mind thought on it, but we know where you stand, and so we have a motion on the floor and the motion from Secretary Cloud, a second from Commissioner Lawrence. So I'm going to take a roll call. We'll see where it lands up and then go from there.
Okay, Commissioner Chavez?
I would like to abstain from this vote since I was not present at the previous meeting.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Clow?
Yes.
Commissioner Faulkner?
I will also be abstaining.
Thank you. Vice Chair Hogan?
No.
Commissioner Lawrence?
Yes.
Commissioner Picciarello?
Yes.
Commissioner Satenia?
No.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I believe you do need 5 to pass the motion, and 3 voted yes, 2 no, and 2 abstained. So the motion failed.
Okay. Thank you. At this point, we can take another motion then.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move approval of the findings of fact and conclusions of law as presented.
Thank you. That was Vice Chair Hogan. If we can get a second.
Commissioner Satania, a second.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second. Is there discussion? Commissioner Satania, please.
Again, I just want to reiterate my stance is that while I am voting to move this forward because everyone voted yes in favor of this at the time of the motion that was presented to them at the last meeting, I would like to point out again that me personally, while I'm voting yes, I think it's important that we are stating whether we are meeting or not meeting the criteria when we are voting. But I don't necessarily agree that should trigger a rescinding of a vote to reconsider the decision that the committee had made. So I just want to add that for the record.
Thank you, Commissioner Satania. Commissioner Lawrence.
Yeah, I just want to note that whatever happens in the discussion about potential rescinding of the earlier vote, this is just the approval of the findings and conclusions from the last meeting. And honestly, procedurally, I think that either route could be fine. If the commission decides to rescind and to make a different decision, then we would just have to rescind these findings. But as it is, I don't see any problem with approving these findings. I didn't see any problem with postponing them either. I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you, Commissioner Lawrence. Any other commissioners discussion? Seeing none, if we can have a roll call vote, please.
Yes, Commissioner Chavez.
I will be abstaining.
Thank you. Commissioner Clow,
Yes.
Commissioner Faulkner.
I will be abstaining.
Thank you. Commissioner, Vice Chair Hogan,
Yes.
Commissioner Lawrence,
Yes.
Commissioner Picarello,
Yes.
Commissioner Satenia.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you.
And I just want to make clear that, so it's on the agenda for the April 1st meeting, that I will be making a motion for us to consider rescinding the decision. And we can discuss it at that point. We can discuss it at our next meeting.
Thank you, Secretary Clow. Melissa, if you'll note for the record that Commissioner Garcia has joined us.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see a hand up, Commissioner Faulkner.
Yeah, I have a question. If the vote, if it gets rescinded and then they go over the project again or the case again, and Commissioner Chavez and I are in attendance, although we couldn't vote on the rescission, could we vote on the case after that?
Chair.
I think probably the best thing to do is we'll get with Sally.
Yeah, that's
when
what I was
she's back,
hoping.
and Mr. Burke, if you'll just present that question to her, so that way there's no guessing, and we'll get you a solid answer.
Yeah, that way we know how to prepare for the meeting, right? Because if they do a rescission and then we hear the case again for some reason, then we would be present to hear the case. So just, Mr. Burke, if you could please get that answer from Sally for the next meeting.
Yes, thank you. And Chair, just so you are prepared, I would prepare that it will be a new hearing. The case will be reheard again. So I'm pretty sure I know the answer to that, but I will get you the answer for the next meeting from Sally directly.
Great,
Thank you. Okay, before we move on, any other commissioners? Okay, so old business, we have none. New business, we have none. And now we're moving on to staff communications. We're going to have informal presentations. And it looks like Alexandra Ladd, Director of Office of Affordable Housing, will be first up for a presentation and a question and answer session.
Good evening, Chair Gutierrez and members of the Commission. Thanks for having us. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate being part of it. I will go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to do a presentation. I'm not going to read it. There's a lot of info. I'm happy to share afterward if you wanted to get some of the details. All right. So I'm going to present what I do at the Office of Affordable Housing. I understand some of our commissioners are fairly new, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to kind of explain what the Office of Affordable Housing is and what we do. I'll also talk a little bit about who I am, for those of you who don't know me. This is my 8.5 year marker of doing this job, and it's my second tour of duty with the city of Santa Fe. I worked for the city as a housing planner from 1999 to 2005. It was my first job out of graduate school. I went to UNM's community regional planning program. So I am a planner at heart. So the Office of Affordable Housing, we're sort of a three-legged stool. We enforce and implement the Santa Fe Homes program, the Inclusionary Zoning program, which is Chapter 26, which also contains a fair housing section. We also work with our local nonprofits to improve programming and build capacity to provide services for the community related to supporting folks' ability to afford housing. This is mostly funded through our general fund. And then we provide funding for programming projects and direct assistance through a little bit through the general fund, but mostly through our federal community development block grant program, CDBG, and locally through our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is also enshrined in city code. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I want to make a really big point here, which is that most people think of the Office of Affordable Housing must be the housing authority. We don't manage any housing. We don't provide any services directly to anybody, any financial assistance directly, but rather we rely on the network of nonprofit community partners here to actually serve the community. So the city's philosophy from 25 years ago has been to build the capacity of these partners, because this ensures that services are nimble and relevant and accessible to the people we're trying to help. And it also means that I don't have to have a staff of 15 people who know how to do income certifications and all of the other details that come with trying to provide housing services. The nonprofit service providers act as subrecipients of federal funds. They're called grantees of local funds. And I think the other important point to make is that by doing this, these partners are able to use the funds that the city provides to them to leverage other funds in a way that the city can't do. So it's a really important piece of why the city's been very effective over the years in supporting people's ability to afford their housing. I'm going to give a super brief history of inclusionary zoning in Santa Fe, because this is what you all see. You see the piece of the affordable housing picture that's related to inclusionary zoning. So inclusionary zoning is a regulation that requires a given share of new construction is affordable for people with low to moderate incomes. And the goal is to encourage the new development, and also availability of housing that's affordable to a broad range of household incomes. So not just to the people who can afford housing in the marketplace. And the nexus here is that we're offsetting the demand for affordable housing that's created by new development and new economic activity. And in Santa Fe, much of that over the years has been from, I'm going to say, this is sort of a weird way to say it, but from non-native sources. So people who have money to spend don't have money to spend here typically because they're earning it here. They have money to spend here because they brought it from somewhere else. So in 1998, the city passed its first inclusionary zoning program, which was called the Housing Opportunity Program. This was one of the first inclusionary zoning programs in the country, actually. What it did was that the percentage of the requirement that was the percentage that was required was based on the market value of the market rate units. So the more expensive a project, the more affordable units the developer had to provide. And then what it also did was projects with naturally occurring affordability were exempt from requirements. So a developer who came in and said, hey, I'm building apartments they're going to rent for a pretty affordable rate because that's my business model and I can make it work, they did not have to comply with the program. In 2006, the Santa Fe Homes program was implemented, and the focus for the Santa Fe Homes program was to simplify HOP. HOP was a little bit complicated because there were lots of variables, and it was sort of a negotiation on a case-by-case basis, which developers didn't like. So it was standardized. A requirement of 30% for affordable home ownership and 15% for rental housing was written into the new ordinance. In 2014, so then, about 5 minutes after the higher requirement was approved, the housing bubble burst and everything collapsed. I'm exaggerating, of course. But in 2014, because our market really hadn't recovered yet, amendments were made to lower the requirement to the current level of 20% for home ownership projects. In 2016, amendments made the 20% permanent and made the fee in lieu an option by right for multifamily rental. There was also a 4-year sunset placed on this amendment. In 2019, that allowance was made permanent. But we also in 2019 created some flexibility in the code. We said, how do we encourage developers to do that naturally occurring affordable housing product? What can we do to offset the fact that our market creates pressure to maximize value no matter what? It's expensive to build here, land costs a lot, infrastructure can be a little substandard, and we've got a really complicated code that requires a very high standard and adds a lot of expense and time to a project. So we came up with 4 options. The recent project that came before you, the Zia Station, chose the 4th option, which is sort of a hybrid option where they're complying with number 3 with 10% of set aside units and then paying a fee in lieu of for the remaining 5%. And this is, and I would say, it seems like, well, that took a while to finally get a first project, but generally when you change land use code, it takes a couple years before it actually takes effect. So we're kind of right on schedule for this. So I'm hoping we get another project that wants to provide some on-site affordability. Okay, so the Santa Fe Homes program, this is where we are increasing supply. Here are all the triggers in the land use code. I won't even read them out. But this is the carrot and stick slide, right? Because we require all of the requirement is triggered by all of these actions, and then we also provide incentives. So the incentives of 15% density bonus if all other elements of the code can be met, and then fee waivers and reductions for all of the different development, permitting, utility expansion charges. And then we hold the value of the fee waivers with a lien against either each affordable home or an entire project, so that if there is a transfer of title, the city does get paid back for that waiver. And insofar as it concerns the Planning Commission, at the application phase, the developer signs a Santa Fe Homes Program proposal. This is not legally binding, and I've had so many people over the years. This is what you all see in your packet. It's not legally binding. What it does is it just lays out what the requirement is, and the developer signs it saying, yes, I understand that my project's subject to this, and I will comply. But it is not the actual agreement. We don't do the agreement until after final entitlements, because sometimes things change. And sorry, my cat's about to knock something over. The joys of the home office. And the agreement is filed with the final development docs or shortly after, so that it is on the title of the property. So if a developer gets approvals and then immediately sells the property before developing it, that next owner still has the obligation. And then at the building permit phases, when the fee waivers are applied, and if there are any remaining fees to be paid, they are paid in full. And now, $1 million question, when can a developer opt to pay a fee in lieu? Never is the answer. Paying a fee is the required form of compliance under limited and very specific circumstances. This is probably the biggest misunderstanding out in the community about the fee in lieu of. If there's a fraction of a unit, because the math works out that way, you can't build 0.6 of a home, so you pay a fee in lieu. For small projects, 2 to 10 units, the governing body felt like smaller builders, smaller scale local builders were were going to be hit especially hard by a 20% requirement or a 15% requirement. So they made an allowance that these small projects could pay a fee. And then here are multifamily rent or occupied projects. So, so this is the allowance that allows the fee in lieu of, but it's only for rental, or this combination option. Or the developer demonstrates an extreme hardship, proposes an alternate compliance that is also demonstrated to better meet identified housing needs. I will tell you, number 4 almost never happens. We've had a couple of situations, but for the most part, we don't work toward that option. We really try to work with the developer to make the compliance happen. So now I'm going to talk about how we support the demand side. And this is in our investments in affordable housing projects, in the financial assistance that we make available through our nonprofits to local folks, is how we support the capacity of the consumer to be able to afford the housing. I'm going to just skim through this because there's so much detail, but again, you'll be able to get the slide and you can read more about it. Our CDBG funding, we're an entitlement city from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, so we get these funds every year. Generally, it's about lately it's been closer to 600,000 per year, but we've had it over 700 a couple of years. And obviously the whole intent of the grant is to meet the needs of low and moderate income people. Here's how CDBG funds have been used over the last 5 years, or I guess not last 5 years. 5 years minus 1 more year. But you can see the majority is used for housing activities, and within those housing activities, the majority is used for down payment assistance. And that's a little bit of a misnomer. It's actually mortgage principal reduction. So it's more than down payment assistance, but it lowers the amount of the loan that the buyer needs to take on, therefore lowering their monthly payment. Public facilities can benefit from CDBG. Typical uses: emergency shelters, childcare centers, social service centers, and then public services. These are capped at only 15% of the total entitlement amount because CDBG is not really intended to be a social services program, but because so many social services are also related to community development needs, they can go hand in hand. And then we've got our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I believe you are all going to be hearing a lot more about this in the news. We've been, several of the city's partners have been working hard to figure out ways to get some reliable, predictable sources of revenue into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And we may have some exciting news quite quickly, but it's not quite public yet. Right now, that the trust fund the revenues are based on the fee in lieu of, and fractional fee payments and payoffs of city held liens, and then land sales and tierra contenta. So every year up until very recently, we would sort of scrape it together and hope that we would have enough to do an allocation, and some years we didn't. Most years it averaged about 400,000 prior to us within the last couple of years collecting quite large fees in lieu of for those rental properties that have gone through the Planning Commission recently and paid the fee in lieu of. I want to just make one point here, which is that this is not just a little ATM for anyone who wants housing funds. There is the whole process for these funds is codified in our code. The chapter 26-3, and everything, all uses have to be compliant with the New Mexico Affordable Housing Act, which I then have to report to the state. So, and administrative services, staffing costs, those are not allowable. It's just the hard costs of housing or direct financial assistance to income certified individuals. And typically, here's how the funds have been used. About 50% for home ownership, either home improvement or down payment assistance, another 40% for rental assistance and supporting rental unit construction, and then about 10% for homeless shelter and other upgrades to more permanent supportive housing facilities. I suspect over the next few months that this spending pattern is going to shift a bit because we are going to have all hands on deck as we come out of the pandemic to keep people housed and prevent eviction and prevent people from losing their homes. The other important point to make is that all of this funding is leveraged. So this is not a grant. It's not just given to any project. There's a requirement that CDBG is leveraged dollar for dollar, and for Affordable Housing Trust Fund, it's $1 for $3. So because of that, it's really handled much more as an investment, and we are able to demonstrate that when the city provides $1 of down payment assistance, about an average of 14 is leveraged through the buyer's resources and the value of their privately financed mortgage. There's a dog fight going on in the next room. Really sorry. And then for rental assistance is about a 1-to-10 ratio so far. We haven't invested in as many rental projects as I would like. So now that we are hoping to have more funds, this will be more of a reality for us, which is exciting. I just wanted to go through a couple of these statistics are a little bit stale, but I think you get the picture. Like, we have a true affordability problem here. And this all shapes what our future housing is going to look like as well. I think there's also sort of a disconnect between the affordability and how and the affordability needs here and how we undertake our land use practices. And again, this is from a couple of years ago. We just did a scan of GIS and looked at how much vacant land, how much land was undeveloped. So that's 1 out of every 5 acres approximately. And when you look at how to make per unit costs, how to lower per unit costs for development, obviously density is the way to go. In the past, and this may have changed because it's so much more expensive right now to develop, materials have gone through the roof. But we sort of considered R7 as the lowest density to be able to build affordably for single family home ownership, and about R14 for rental development. But when you look at how many acres in the city are actually zoned at high enough densities, it's less, or it's just about 20%. So again, 1 out of every 5 acres, which is not going to meet our affordable housing need. So we're really going to have to look at how do we mobilize our land resources in a way to make building more efficient and more cost effective, so that we can pass that savings on to the consumer. And just really quickly, I think this is my last slide. Just a couple of things we've worked on recently. The ADU ordinance was amended to make the rules more flexible, with the idea that we could create some more options for housing, not necessarily subsidized or affordable, but at least creating sort of more incremental infill. The STR process, regulatory improvements have been made for short-term rentals, which is another issue, because we can actually start collecting some of that revenue and apply it to affordable housing. We purchased the Santa Fe Suites, and we did it in 2 months. It was, well, the city didn't. The city invested in it, provided equity through the CARES Act funds. And upcoming, we are going to be disposing of city-owned land. We want to support affordable housing, maybe a little bit of market rate, mixed income housing, rental and home ownership. And we've got several sites picked out that can accommodate all different kinds of housing. So that will be exciting and coming your way too. Oh yeah, I've got this last one. I just wanted, when we look at demographics, we know that our households are smaller and older, except for Spanish-speaking households, which are larger and lower income. All of this data will be updated too, of course, as soon as we get our new census data. But this means that, well, this doesn't mean, but single family development, so the 3-bedroom detached house, is probably going to be it's always going to be a product that people want, but it's going to be less of an economic driver than in the past, because folks are seeking smaller homes. They want to be closer to transit services, amenities. When HomeWise started their project on Agua Fria, El Camino Crossing, they did some outreach to potential customers and said, so we're going to build this project. Well, what would you all like to see? As an infill project, they knew that they had sort of limited space, and they wanted to make the most of it and make sure they were really responding to what the market wanted. And people said, we want something small. we want something with flexible space. We want to be able to run our businesses out of our houses. And I only want 1 bedroom, which was a bit of a surprise. Like, it wasn't what they had heard in the past. And so that's what they've designed over there. It's sort of it's not a tiny house, but it's kind of a smallish house type of single family subdivision. And then they're doing mixed use on the front part of the property. So I think that is going to become a significant part of the market moving forward. And then just to leave you on this note, as the city has become a homeless provider, a homeless shelter provider over at the campus, we're looking to make permanent housing options for all of those folks. And the only way that can be effective is if supportive services are provided in alignment with the unit. And I think I've said that in front of this group before. When you have a market rate developer, it doesn't make any sense to ask that market rate developer to provide a unit for somebody with very high needs. That high needs person needs all of the support services and needs to live somewhere that can meet them where they're at and take care of all of their other social needs as well. So that's something we're figuring out. First-hand experience. And with that, I will stop sharing. And I wasn't sure if Chair Gutierrez, if you wanted to go through all the presentations and then do questions, or questions now.
Let me check with the commissioner, see if there's any questions fresh in their head that they might want to ask. Did you get any questions submitted to you that you like to read off and answer, or did you not get any questions submitted?
Submitted directly to me?
Yes, I know that Mr. for questions, and I don't know if anybody sent any in or not.
I had a couple of conversations, but I don't know. I don't think I really kept track of the official question. So maybe the commissioners can frame those questions again.
Okay. Commissioners, do you want to hear the rest of the presenters and then ask questions, or does anybody have a question they'd like to ask now? All right, so what we'll do, we'll move on and we'll save all the questions for after the presentation. Thank you, Ms. Ladd, we appreciate you coming in and talk to us. Next up is Mr. Daniel Orwith.
Chair Gutierrez, I actually had my hand up. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get a lot of information thrown at us. So I actually wanted to take some time to ask Ms. Ladd some questions before we get too ahead of ourselves.
That'll be fine.
So, Alexander, thank you for presenting and bringing this information to us. So I really do appreciate it. And I know that we've had an opportunity to have a conversation before this. And one of the things that I just want to ask you and kind of get on the mat here is, where do you see the impediments that exist from your perspective with regards to the land use code? I did look through chapter 26 here, and it specifically states that the creation of the Office of Affordable Housing, one of the things is in administering this chapter, which I'm probably reading something you're very familiar with, but I just want to share with others, is that the Office of Affordable Housing shall work with the Planning and Land Use Department to eliminate conflict and duplication in the permitting and development approval process. So just that example, I'm interested to know how you work with the Land Use Department, and also what impediments do you see in the current Land Use Code, which is exacerbating these problems that we see with affordable housing in the city.
Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Satenya, the rest of the plan. That's funny. I had forgotten that it was so explicit on what we're supposed to be doing. And we do work closely. I'm on the development review team, so I'm having conversations with my colleagues in land use and all across the city all the time, from sort of start to finish with each of the projects. I would say that, and I think both Daniel and Carlos will get more into this in detail as well. You know, I think we're really hampered. Like, the number one easiest way to make the production of housing more affordable or less costly is to increase density. And that is just kind of the third rail here. And we don't have a lot of sort of community buy-in on that idea. And certainly the other point would be that density doesn't do a lot of good if it's way out on the fringes of town either. So we're sort of, the double whammy there is we want density in town. We want density close to things. We want density where people don't have to own a car, where they can walk or ride a bike or take a bus where they need to go, and where it's easy to get all of their other needs met within the same area. So I think just simply off the top of my head, I would say that we need to densify.
Sorry, I muted myself. And again, specific to the land use code, where do you see the gaps or the impediments in that in terms of what would make the most difference from your perspective? And I know you don't work within the land use department, but I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Setenia, I think there's some process issues that are complicated and add some uncertainty. I think the code also potentially has some outdated requirements. So drainage requirements that were developed before we had really good technology for water catchment. So there's some lot coverage issues that maybe there doesn't need to be as much drainage area if you can do a better job of catching water, which then increases your building footprint and the number of units you can provide on a site. I think some of the setbacks and step backs can be fairly intimidating in terms of how much space they end up taking away from a building. So I think, and I know Carlos will talk about this more too, some of those could really be more on a case-by-case basis. And we've got a lot of underdeveloped land along our corridors, it's parking lots right now. And if my dream would be that we would start densifying our corridors and building mixed use and housing in those areas where there's already infrastructure and access to transit and grocery stores and schools, and the things that people need to be located near.
Got it. One of the things that we also, in conversations with people trying to prepare for this meeting, it was brought up that there's discriminatory practices that are kind of baked into the zoning of cities. And I was hoping that you could actually speak to that a little more, because it seems like that's a predominant problem that's, again, perpetuating or exacerbating this issue. And I don't understand yet what the city's actually doing to address that, or you working with the with the land use department to eliminate these types of conflicts.
Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Setenia, I think when you look at that statistic I showed in my slide, and again, that probably there could be a better analysis of that, but it's pretty simple. It looks at zoning by acre, and if only 1 out of every 5 acres in your municipality is zoned at a high enough density to support any kind of affordable development. Now we're talking about, we can subsidize development and we can pay for the cost of expensive development, and because of the subsidy, not pass that cost on to the consumer. But we also want to see affordability happening in the marketplace. And so we know it's not going to if it's only 1 out of every acre, 1 out of every 5 acres can support anything that could be the least bit developed affordably. So I think that continues. I mean, I will go out on a limb and say that I do believe that zoning is a form of institutionalized exclusion and has had disparate impacts on people of color and people of low income. And I think research in other places has demonstrated that's probably true. Several communities are taking really drastic steps to try to remediate that by abolishing single family zoning or taking, redeveloping areas with a really different mindset. And I don't, that might not be appropriate for our community, but I do feel like we took a step in the direction when we designed the link overlay for St. Mike's, which created this idea that you could have more flexible land use code if the resulting development was achieving a community-wide objective. And I think, I think we need to double down. I think we need to do that in other places and really figure out what are the other barriers that get in the way of folks developing in infill and more densely more dense development.
Got it. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. I might have one or two more and then we can move on, but I wanted to not dominate the time here.
Mr. Lawrence put her hand up, so.
There we go.
Let's go
All
to
right,
her.
I'll
We'll
step
come
back.
back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Satania. Commissioner Lawrence, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alexandra, I'm just curious if you've done any research within the city, collected any data on the various impacts of the inclusionary zoning and the related housing programs that the city has done. I mean, nationally, you sometimes see that there have been studies about it actually, increasing housing prices or affecting supply, or potentially having limits on the diversity of the community, that only certain types of people are able to access units, things like that. And I'm wondering if you've done any sort of research or analysis tracking of what that looks like here in Santa Fe.
Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Lawrence, yes. When I first started in this job in 2012, the 30% requirement was in place, and I started looking at research, and that was really, really high. There were very few communities that had a requirement that high. And then at the time it was brought down temporarily to 20%, and that felt a little bit more reasonable. And when I would talk to developers, they would say, yeah, I can make those numbers work. I think also on the home ownership side, it's a really different situation than on the rental side, because we try to make it as easy as possible for the for single family developers. They work closely with either nonprofit, HomeWise, or the Housing Trust. So their buyers are basically handed to them. They have like pre-qualified buyers with financing ready to go. So they don't have a lot of marketing costs, and they can write those losses on those affordable units like right into their budgets. So they're not, they're in and out. They sell that home, they know what the loss is, and they're done. And so I really don't think on the single family home ownership side there has been much of a negative impact. On the rental side, we had no rental development because of the inclusionary zoning program and because of other issues too as we came out of the recession. But that was, I heard developers just said to me, no, I won't even look at Santa Fe. There is no way. There's no way to make those numbers work, because it's not the cost of building the unit, because they all cost the same to build. It's the fact that I have to take that loss every month. So, and then it's compounded over the number of units. So I'm looking at, $900,000 over the course of 10 years that those units have cost me. That's really different than taking a loss because you sell a home for $175,000 when you could sell it in the marketplace for, $300,000. That's a loss, but it's not actually your cost out of pocket. This is cost out of pocket. So, and I think the proof is in the concept, right? As soon as we allowed the fee in lieu of, guess what? Our market started opening up and we started getting projects. And now we're going to have a lot of new rental units that are market priced, most of them. But that's going to help some of the logjam that we've had on the rental side. And when I looked at that, when I researched how inclusionary zoning works on the rental side in other communities, it was pretty clear that it works in very high value, very high density situations. So it works in a Chicago skyscraper or in San Francisco or in Manhattan because there's so many more units and the loss can be spread out over the market rate units. but that in a low density market on the rental side, it's just almost unworkable.
Thank you. No other questions right now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Lawrence. Commissioner Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize, guys, for being late. I was stuck in traffic and coming from my business in Espanola. So I want to just kind of make a comment in terms of this. And you hear it from a lot of people, especially on the South Side, because that's where I work, that's where I live. And that's a lot of times people that come and want to discuss. I have an employee who comes to me and he knows I'm on the planning commission and he says, boss, can't you do something? My rent's going up again. And he's already paying $1,100 for a single bedroom apartment on Airport Road. And so, I got to kind of explain to him a little bit that, a lot of it has to do with supply, demand. And so these are the type of things that a lot of people come to discuss when in terms of renting a place, buying a place, and being able to live and work here in the city. The other question that I get a lot of times from people is, well, why are they building so much? Why are you guys approving so many developments? And the simple answer is we don't have enough inventory. So there's a lot of aspects to this affordability in Santa Fe, and I think that having the inventory is definitely a plus as it's getting built. But I go back to how do I answer the question to my employee who says, "Man, they're going to raise my rent another $100," and I guess the question to Ms. Ladd would be is how well does your division get the word out to people that do need the help and the assistance and paying their to utilize these funds that are being supplied to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to help them maybe reduce their rent somewhat, because they do want to live here. They have to live here. And we don't want these people driving to Albuquerque every day. We want them living in our city. And so how well does your division try to get that advertising out to people so they can get that assistance?
Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Garcia, thank you for the question. And that's kind of the age-old question, and I don't have a good answer. Because the funds go through a services provider, the city doesn't really assist with any outreach. And up to this time, most of the providers have been serving a really specific constituency. So the nonprofit Adelante at Santa Fe Public Schools, for instance, works with families who are homeless. So they're using their funds to help those families. Youth works with young people and people who are disconnected from their families. And so they're providing help to those young people. So we don't really have a great system for, come one, come all if you need help paying your rent, unless you're able to get approved for a long-term subsidy like a Section 8 voucher or something like that. But I do think that as all of this inventory comes online, the market is going to soften to some extent, where the property owners, because right now they can raise the rent every time the lease term is up because people have nowhere to go. And so they're stuck in a situation where they just have to keep paying more and more rent if they want to stay in Santa Fe. And I think at some point it's going to get to the point where they're going to have to stop doing that, because there are going to be so many more options for people to live in, and the property owners will be financially motivated to keep their tenants, because that's much more effective for them than to have turnover in their units. So, at some point, that's a bad answer, right? Like, well, hold it, hang in there as long as you can by the skin of your teeth, and hopefully the pressure will be alleviated. And the other unfortunate thing is, even though I'm sure these folks feel like, God, I don't make enough money, they probably still don't qualify for assistance under these programs, because the criteria, especially on the federal side, is is pretty limiting. We did 1 year, well, actually it was right before I started this job. The person before me did a study looking at all of the incomes that first responders in Santa Fe made, because that was a big issue. Like our firefighters and our police officers can't afford to live here. And as it turned out, almost all of them earned too much to qualify for any kind of assistance. So it was sort of like, well, I guess, yeah, it's hard. I completely, I hear that.
So then hearing that answer, I guess maybe, it has to be looked at as to how we can provide some sort of percentage assistance to people that, and here again, you're looking at the person that works at the supermarket that makes, 12, 13, 14, $15 an hour, maybe has to have 2 jobs, dual income just to make the rent, and more than half of their income is going to pay the rent. So and going back to possibly challenging somebody to take a look at how the outreach is to get to these people to say, hey, this is how we can help you, and not sit on the funds there. So I appreciate the answer, and those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. Vice Chair Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're kind of touching on this subject, but I think when you updated us a couple of years ago, Alexandra, that there was a demand of about 3,500 units. And during that time, we have approved, it seems like thousands. It hasn't been that many, but I understand the demand is now expanded as well. At our current build rate, which seems extreme, not that it is, it's just such a contrast from where we've been in terms of housing. Are we keeping up with the growing demand at the rate we're building?
So Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Hogan, I might let Eli answer that to some extent. I think for the very low income renters, so the people that Commissioner Garcia was talking about, no, we're never, ever, the marketplace is never, ever going to produce enough units for those folks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Gutierrez, Vice Chair Hogan. It seems like we've approved a lot of units in this here in Planning Commission because we have. I mean, I think we have something like 2,200 plus or minus units currently under construction here in the city of Santa Fe. We have another roughly, I think it's 1,800 that have been approved at Planning Commission that are awaiting permits to begin construction. And then we have another about 700 behind that are sort of pending, that have yet to come to Planning Commission. So we are making strides towards filling that need and that demand here in Santa Fe. But I think you're right that the demand continues to grow as we continue to provide more units in our city. And so we haven't been able to fully close that gap recently, as we've seen an increase in housing production across the city.
So we shouldn't be worried that we're approving too much too fast. It seems like we still have a big gap to fill.
Commissioner Hogan, I would say that's true. And especially now as we come out of the pandemic, our world has changed radically. And when we may have the true Zoom boom here, Lanel's expanding and they're bringing in, I think, 2,000 new employees over the next year or so to work at the labs and to work in their administration. So we're going to have pressure to provide units in general across the market.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more question, if you don't mind.
Well, please.
Particularly in the Midtown Link, I'm trying to think of any other locations in the city where we're trying to increase density, and we pretty much seem to have about a 5-story ceiling, everywhere in Santa Fe. Is there any place like the Link where you think there might be an appetite for more height, particularly if it's carefully placed?
Commissioner Hogan, I would probably defer to my land use colleagues for that question. Yeah, I don't really know.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, Vice Chair Hogan. So I think recently we, the Presbyterian Hospital down in Las Solares, I believe if you measure from the rear of the building, because the site sort of slopes front to rear. At the rear of the building, I believe the building measures 75 feet in height, which is a 6-story building with some equipment and things, elevator overruns and whatnot on the roof. And so that building, I believe, is 75 feet at its sort of tallest point above adjacent grade. So there may be opportunities for more of that type of development of that scale in areas like that. But currently, the only places where we're really sort of explicitly allowing height bonuses for delivering on, as Alex mentioned earlier, these sort of community wants and expressed desires is in the Link Overlay District. So that's where we are sort of adding height for delivering on things like affordability or relationship to the public realm, landscaping, things like that. High energy performance, those types of things.
Great. Okay, that's it for me, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hogan. Commissioner Faulkner and then Commissioner Picciarello. Commissioner Faulkner.
I just wanted to echo a couple of things. One, my son turned 18 and wanted to move out of our home and cannot find an apartment, either in the low income apartments or market value apartments. Like, I did not realize how serious the problem was until he started looking for a place to live. And I do think that there are, the city has a large retirement community, but there's also a lot of young people who would like to stay in Santa Fe who are finding it difficult to do so because there just is not the capacity in housing for them, especially kind of the college age kids. So I just to echo what Commissioner Garcia and Commissioner Hogan said, I don't think we'll hit capacity anytime soon, especially because of COVID. There's going to be people who are losing their homes and have to live in apartments. And in addition, Los Alamos National Laboratories, my whole family, all the men in my family work at Los Alamos, and a lot of them are in management positions. And one of the things that they're doing is Los Alamos National Laboratories is buying up apartment complexes, offices, buildings, like all sorts of things, because their initiatives now that they're looking at is they're looking at keeping a lot of their administrative people not in Los Alamos because they're landlocked in Los Alamos, but putting them in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Pojoaque, wherever the availability is. So we're going to have that competition for housing as well. I know we think Santa Fe has a housing issue, but Los Alamos's housing issue is, it's beyond the pale. It's ridiculous. And so we have that we're going to be contending with as well. And so a couple of things that I see as a commissioner that we really have to focus on is, and I said this in the last meeting, was the things that we valued in the 70s and 80s no longer apply to the needs of our population. And so we do have to address zoning. We have to address it in a way that allows for density, that allows for height, not only because our population is going to need it, but also because environmentally sprawl is a bad idea. And so, I think we're in this unique and challenging position as a commission and the city council, that we're kind of the bridge decision makers between one way of considering how to build a town and how to live in a town versus what the reality is, which is we're a city now. And that has a different set of needs and values. And Eli, I want to get this on the record. Is it not true that in order to get the infrastructure we need to sustain the population that we have, density does become an issue because there's a formula between density and infrastructure allowances and opportunities?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Faulkner. Yes, I mean, I think just speaking in very general terms, and I think you've seen this happen in other communities in the country where, that's one of the big sort of hidden costs of sprawl, right? Is that you grow at a low density that does not generate the types of revenues a city needs to extend infrastructure to the edges of your city. And so a low density development puts a lot of strain on a city's resources and its ability to provide services to its constituents. And so there is a sort of sweet spot in terms of density and at the density at which you grow at that current development subsidizes adequately the needs of future development. And I don't have an exact number to say like that needs to be, R7 or that needs to be R12. I don't have that number. I haven't looked at it at that sort of level of granularity or specificity, but generally speaking, yes, low density development at your urban periphery is costly and does not set you up for long-term infrastructure improvements down the road and leave cities holding the bag for future development.
Thank you, Eli. And then one more thing, Mr. Chair. One of the concerns I have is that our zoning doesn't allow for infill in a lot of the places that are the best places to put density, because like Alexandra said, they're walkable to grocery stores, to job, to employment opportunities, to eateries, all the economic development components that go into building community. And it seems like our zoning prefers to kind of push that stuff out to the peripheral, so you build this great apartment complex and you get rid of the parking lot so that you can put more units in. You get rid of a whole bunch of things to encourage developers to build these kind of units, but the people who live there are isolated from any kind of resource or amenity or anything that kind of density would benefit from. And so I do think we really have to look at our zoning. I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges, is that there's some decision makers and some people in power and some people with the resources to want to keep their neighborhoods exactly how they've been for 100 million years. And our city just can't tolerate that because we don't have the resources to put a ton of grocery stores or to do a great bus line out to the periphery. And so I think we're going to run into a lot of controversy around, how do we do infill where it's best suited to do high density and not come up against people who don't like their views of the mountains blocked or they don't want 8 houses there or 52 apartments. They want to keep it this quaint little town that they bought a home in. And the reality is that is not strategically sound, and it doesn't make for good development. So anyway, those are all my points around affordable housing, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Faulkner. We're going to go to Commissioner Picciarello, and we have 2 other presenters. So go ahead, Commissioner Picciarello.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So this is a question related to that middle range of folks who don't qualify for financial assistance, but have a really hard time affording to live here. As I've been watching former coworkers leaving and going to Denver, and I'm wondering, first, how are changes to code that affect our rental code affect these demographics? And then how are we tracking some of this loss that we're going to be seeing over this past year, maybe this coming year? If we're tracking that and how we're tracking that. And that's a question for Ms. Ladd.
Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Picarello, I don't think I know the answer. I think the allowing multifamily developers to pay the fee in lieu of has certainly sort of loosened up the inventory issue. And we don't know what the longer term benefits or perhaps downsides will be to that yet. We're still kind of waiting to see. In terms of, I think really the only data that we would have access to right now, or at least, and maybe Daniel or Carlos have other ideas about this too. You know, when we get our census data for 2020, we'll be able to look at kind of the changes in the demographic in terms of age and profession and all those other things. And I think, you know, some of this will be possibly evident, but it's also hard to know whether, you know, we've had some positives in that direction too, with people moving here for jobs. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I really don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, I understand. It's a hard question, especially, you know, the census data, you know, only gives us this very big picture. And I think it's really helpful for not just us, but the public to understand what that housing crisis means. Commissioner Faulkner brought up a very good point. You don't, if you're a homeowner and you're in your home, you may not see it. You know, you may not really know that it's happening. And because it's not the renters that usually show up to these meetings, but they are really vastly impacted by it. And I would just watch coworkers or, you know, young designers, really talented folks that we lose, or that move here and that they end up having to switch rentals every 6 months, because that's what was happening, because their rent would just be driven up. And, you know, they're not making the wage. And then, you know, we're looking at people who are about to get their architecture license. You know, this is not like, you know, one would think that you could afford to live here, but this is changing very quickly underneath our feet. So, yeah, I guess, you know, I'd love to follow up with you later and just ask a more depthful questions on how that is possible, how to track some of these questions so that it turns into data that we can all collectively understand. Mm-hmm. I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Picarello. Anybody else who hasn't asked questions of Ms. Ladd before we move on? Okay, Ms. Ladd, turn off your camera, relax, and we'll circle back to you after all the presentations are done. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Werwith, you ready?
I am. Thank you, Chair, members of the commission, staff. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you tonight. I've put together a short, well, we'll see, medium length presentation. I felt like a lot of the conversation we just had was a really good segue. I have this background not just because I am zooming in from my garage, but because Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon was the largest multifamily housing structure in the United States until 1882, when a larger apartment building was built in New York City. And I think I like to keep that there sometimes to remind us that sometimes our ideas of what's historical is a little bit of a construct. So just like to start with that. I'm gonna share my screen and jump into this presentation now, and just let me know if this comes up okay. And into presenter mode. So mostly speaking on behalf of the Housing Coalition today. That's an organization I helped co-found a few years ago, realizing that we needed sort of an an organization to contain the voices of a lot of folks that don't get represented in our public processes. And the very folks that move away, or, you know, in my experience, people who get forced out of town because of affordability don't tend to write their city councilors about their problems, right? They just move. So really thinking about how we bring together diverse groups of people to sort of advocate for housing, large employers, housing nonprofits. We have the Chamber of Commerce and the Home Builders Association, all pulling in the same direction, which is really unique in this moment. And I say that having worked in affordable housing here since 2003, I started out as a homebuyer counselor at the Housing Trust, basically fresh out of college. Also following the heels of work my dad did here in the 90s as a consultant with the city of Santa Fe to help set up some of the initial affordable housing programs. So I have a pretty long view that is sort of generational. And I've spent since then a lot of times developing nonprofit housing programs, policies, working in housing development. I'm currently building the Seiler Yard project, which was supported by the city, both in terms of a land donation and housing trust fund monies. I've also worked around the country, both as a technical assistance provider for HUD through Enterprise Community Partners. I've worked with, you know, small towns and the city of Houston, and then done a lot of strategic planning with cities in the Mountain West. And so I have a unique perspective that sort of crosses policy, practice, development, and then, you know, sort of understanding what are the things that are the same about the problems in the Mountain West, which are a lot, and what are different in our community. And there's a few. I also served as a member of the Board of Adjustment, your junior land use board, for 10 years. So I have sat in the seats you would normally sit in if you were sitting in city council chambers. And so, you know, I've seen this from a lot of different sides, and I try and bring that to the advocacy work that I do, the housing development work that I do, and the policy development work that I do. So I think it's really helpful to understand the nature of the housing problem. I think we simplify it as a single affordability problem, when really there's two different problems happening at the same time, and we don't disambiguate those well. And we a lot of times throw out possible solutions because they don't fix two different problems, and that's not a good way to approach it. So the biggest one is that the federal government doesn't treat housing as a right. And what that means is that unlike things like you know, maybe food stamps or Medicare, if you meet certain eligibility criteria, you are funded to have those services, right? Housing, we only receive nationally about 1/5 of the resources we need to help people who will never earn enough to be able to afford even the most basic, decent market rate housing, right? That's disabled folks, the elderly, very, very low income folks who just don't have a lot of market rate housing options. So the local governments, state governments, cities and counties end up basically having to figure out how to cover this 4/5 gap. And that's a lot of what Alexandra was talking about in subsidized housing programs. And Santa Fe is unique. We both have you know, city support, but we have nonprofits working on housing. And then we actually engage the private sector through inclusionary zoning to help solve our affordable housing problems. The other problem is really more of an unforced error, and that's the supply and demand crisis we face. And that's really where you start to hear affordability issues impacting, you know, people with professional jobs in the rental market, right? People saying like, I'm a nurse, but I can't live in Santa Fe, or I can't buy a house in Santa Fe. That's really a different problem, and it trickles down and, you know, ultimately affects everyone, affects the lowest income people the most. And it makes it harder to do affordable housing because more people need subsidization. But I'm going to really focus mostly tonight on the supply and demand piece of that, because that's the part that, you know, the city really controls the means of production around housing through zoning and other mechanisms, through quasi-judicial boards like yourselves. And so it's really important to sort of understand, you know, in terms of, you know, how we approach this, what we can affect. And so I'm going to just run through some stats, and most of these have been covered, but like we've basically been at a 0% rental vacancy rate since 2014. So we slipped under 5% vacancy, which means that essentially a lot of the availability of housing is basically how units that are turning over, being repaired, things like that. And as we mentioned, I don't know the exact number. I think all of this is a bit of witchcraft because it's hard to really model this stuff accurately. I've heard numbers as high as 6,000 units. So even if you add up our entire pipeline of units, I think we're not quite there. We also need at least 2,500 units of very affordable housing, so very low income families, subsidized housing, and we're currently only building between 0 and 100 units of that a year. So we see a need to dramatically increase the amount of lower income rental housing before we get more balanced. Market rates in apartment complexes in Santa Fe increased almost 50% in the 5-year period following the drop in vacancy that led to that supply constrained market. And the census data tells us that there were more than 10,000 households that were paying unaffordable rents or mortgage, what we call cost burden in the census data. So people paying more than 30% of their income for housing before the pandemic. That's 2019 data, right? So that's almost, at least a third of Santa Fe, if you assume those are average sized families. The thing that's really shaking things up now, and I think we won't know for a while what's really happening and how dramatic this is that we are having really crazy outside pressure on our housing markets, both home ownership and rental. And, we can see that the Q4 2020 median sales price for home ownership was $606,000, which is, historically unprecedented. Even in the city where it's typically lower, less luxury homes in that market, we're tipping close to $500,000 and a nearly 30% year-on-year increase, which is just a really, really dramatic shift happening in housing. And the problem is when we don't have enough housing, prices reset to the highest capacity to pay. And that's right now not local workers, that's people that are moving here. The other thing that's really challenging is right now, housing costs have never been higher to build housing, construction costs. We have a lot of things playing into that. Demand is a big one, the slowdown after the 2009 economic downturn. And now there's a boom in housing. But things like climate-driven natural disasters driving materials costs up. Things like, don't try and get a transformer right after hurricane season. Things like that we're starting to have to deal with, which are new realities. And I think it's worth noting that the Zoom boom phenomena has been happening for a long time. A lot of people have been relocating to beautiful places in the Mountain West that are desirable. But this has really gone on steroids in the last year, and we're starting to see more younger professionals with coastal incomes moving in, and there's just not enough housing for the people who live here already, and we have a lot of people coming here. So it's a really sort of huge threat for gentrification, displacement of locals and local workers that we're dealing with. So this is just a really great graphic to kind of show you where we're at with housing production. You can see that on the left, that's census housing units and population. So in 2010, you see the leveling off of new housing units. But at the same time, what you see is relatively dramatic increases in population. So you see that divergence of population and housing units pretty dramatically starting around 2010. On the right, you see permit issuance for the city and county. And you can see after the economic downturn, and this only runs through 2017, and we obviously have seen a big uptick with the multifamily approvals and permitting lately. But we're making up for, basically 8-9 years of not developing anywhere close to enough housing to keep up with population growth, right? And there's a lot of things that basically go into that, right? So there's a lot of not just economic obstacles, but we have things like a very developed, sort of almost formalized process for NIMBYism in our town, which is sort of codified in a lot of our land use code. Things like the early neighborhood notification process, which I think is very detrimental to productive conversations, even though the intent is to create more collaborative processes around development. I find that it entrenches two sides, a very us versus them process, which makes it very hard to make new development beneficial to existing neighborhoods. We have wild levels of exclusionary zoning policies. So we talked about inclusionary zoning, right? How new housing needs to include affordability, but we have a lot of places that are basically exempted from affordable housing, low density zoning, historic overlays, things like that. And I'll talk more about it. And then, you know, I joke a lot of times that Santa Fe has never met a problem that it can't like ordinance its way out of. And so we have a very complex and layered land use code, much of which works cross purposes to each other. I think, you know, when we haven't aligned our code in a way that we understand sort of a hierarchy of what our priorities are. I think that makes land use decisions very hard. And then the lack of long-term growth planning that would do things like say, these are the growth areas, you know, affordable housing is more important than views, but not as important as parking or whatever that hierarchy is, which we haven't really even checked in about in the last 25 years since the last, you know, comprehensive plan, general plan. And then on the affordable housing side, we have shrinking federal subsidy resources, basically, just less and less money to do subsidized housing and more people who require subsidized housing. As Alexander pointed out, our local funding sources are highly variable, dependent on things like fees in lieu, which some years are big, some years are small, never enough and not enough to allow us to do multi-year planning. And as I mentioned before, just construction costs, especially post-COVID, are unbelievable. Like things like only being able to have one sub in a housing unit at a time for COVID safety starts to add cost. But Seiler Yard, a good example, the costs on that project went up almost $1.5 million because of the pandemic, in the time between when we were awarded subsidy and when we started construction on a $17 million project, right? So it's quite significant what we're seeing, and it's a big challenge all the way around. So what creates housing affordability? So obviously increased housing supply helps create affordability, right? In supply constrained markets, prices reset to the highest capacity to pay. That's not local. So it's people selling coastal houses. That's people with retirement incomes. That's people with coastal jobs that get paid a lot more than local workers. And that's who gets left behind when we don't have enough housing. And as Alexander rightly pointed out, one of the biggest ways to create more affordability is through density. And I'm going to go into some more details about that. I'm actually going to show you an example from Seiler Yard. If I was to lower the density, how that would impact the construction costs. But density sets the floor for how expensive housing can be, particularly in markets like Santa Fe that have really high land costs, that typically have really high exactions built into our land use code. So we require a lot of parking, a lot of drainage, and then all the offsite improvements, right? We don't build roads, developers build roads. We don't build sewer, developers build sewer. That all impacts affordability, right? That stuff we load into development. Even inclusionary zoning, right? Like that is in a way a tax, and we try and balance it with incentives like density bonuses, but there are some unintended consequences that come from that. The other big one is increased investment in housing assistance programs. I've been working for the last 2 years to try and get $3 million a year dedicated to the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That's a #1 coalition goal. That was a goal from the Mayor's Task Force on Affordable Housing. I can't say how much I've been wishing we had that resources to respond to the pandemic. It would have really changed how we could have approached things like rental assistance and other things that we really could have deployed early on to help families. And, you know, like all of the subsidized housing benefits from more housing supply, right? Like when you don't, the less people that need subsidy, the less subsidy you need, right? The things like that all have trickle down effects. When you lower the cost of housing development and infrastructure requirements, that benefits affordable housing, that benefits homeless shelters, that benefits market rate housing. So it's a sort of, it helps everybody. And it's also worth understanding, like from a macro community perspective, the other benefits of housing density, right? Like we talked about how it sets the floor for how inexpensive rents or mortgages can be. but like density also makes infill projects more financially feasible, right? We see a ton of growth on the edge of town, but we don't see infill growth at the rate that you would expect for the amount of vacant land that we have in the city. And more density makes higher cost to develop land more financially feasible. It creates economies of scale that make construction costs less expensive, right? When you're building, 100 homes instead of 50, the cost of building gets cheaper. And then there's some like macro community things, like it's better for climate change because we're lowering water and energy consumption, traffic, and increasing the feasibility of public transportation and non-vehicular transportation options. And ultimately, despite the widespread beliefs that are propagated in this town that density hurts neighborhoods, objectively, looking across the country, looking at towns our size that have like adopted density policies, they tend to be better for neighborhoods. They increase amenities. They create more economic, racial, and age diversity, which really benefits communities. And it helps alleviate things like we're seeing now, like where we have overcrowded schools on the south side and empty schools in existing neighborhoods, which really directly ties to land use and cost of housing when you get down to it, right? There's a lot of like corollary negative impacts from exclusionary housing policies. So I wanted to do a development math example. This really like came to me from watching your hearing about the Zia Station development, where there's this big debate about 2 versus 3 stories and what's feasible and what isn't. And so I just took the project that I have real numbers for, and I added up all my fixed costs. So land, infrastructure, utility, offsite improvements, architects, financing costs, lawyers, all that stuff. And you can see here that that all came for that project about $3.2 million, right? And so at 65 units on 4.2 acres, that's a 15.5 unit per acre density. Those per unit fixed costs are about $50,000. Now, if you do a third reduction, which is like taking a floor off, and for us, it would actually be even higher because we're a 2/1. So if you take one of the stories, we actually lose half of our apartments. Because we have 2-story, 2 bedrooms over 1-story, 1-bedroom apartments. But I just, to be fair, used a third because it's 1 floor out of 3. That drops the density down to 10 units per acre, and that increases the per unit cost $25,000, right? This isn't trivial amounts of money, and this isn't stuff that developers can just absorb in the context of current housing development realities, where developers are making single digits, barely double digit profit margins on some of these projects in the face of like huge risks, right? Like little mistakes cost millions of dollars sometimes in housing development, right? So the other thing that we don't think about this, so this increases the per unit fixed costs 50%. And it also means that you have less revenue coming in. And so you have a smaller mortgage. And so you have higher costs and less money to pay for it. And it's really pinches it both ways. So it is really detrimental. The other thing I just point out that a lot of people don't think about is operational costs. And so, Seiler Yard's an affordable housing project. And so it's a little different than market rate projects in that we have some extra staff costs around income certification and other things, but it is going to cost utilities, staffing, maintenance, repairs, almost $500 per unit per month to run this apartment complex. And that's something that I don't think people, especially in approval processes, really think about. That like, even if we paid for housing outright, had no mortgage, which we have a $5.4 million mortgage, we'd still have to charge $500 a month in rent to cover our hard costs for things like water, sewer, trash, utilities, staffing, lease up, all that stuff. So that's a really important thing to consider when we're doing, sort of rough sketch math in our head around this stuff. So what are the density constraints? What keeps us from achieving higher densities? And so obviously we have zoning is a big one, right? That tells us how many units per acre, what types of uses we can do, things like setbacks, which came up, which are very sort of antiquated ideas around, single family development that sort of have become accepted. But also site infrastructure requirements, roadways, really wide roadways, parking, open space requirements, drainage and ponding, those take up site area. And so by the time you see a project in front of you, basically all the housing that can be stuck on there has been stuck on there with the parking, with the open space, with the roadways. There's not a lot, no one's leaving any housing on the table when it gets to you guys. So the other big issue with it, which is a density constraint, is the idea of downzoning. So those are the processes by which in public hearings, we whittle away at housing density that basically makes it so developers can't achieve the full density that they're entitled to under zoning, right? And that's one of the biggest problems in Santa Fe, one of the biggest problems that you potentially have the ability to impact. And it's really, really a product of unequal access to our public processes, strong organized neighborhood opposition to growth and development that often uses very, very counterfactual arguments as a basis that we reward by lowering density. But like, I think the thing to understand is that at the end, there's no escaping this reality that density correlates closely with affordability, race, income, and age. And so if you look at these pictures, I hope they're visible enough on your screen, but what these three pictures basically do on top of our zoning districts and the light yellow and brighter yellow are R5 and lower zoning categories, right? So on the bottom left, you can see where we've produced affordable housing in the last, since the 90s. And that's from 2013. So obviously it's a little old data, but it gives you an idea. So you look at those denser zoning categories, which are the not yellow things, and you see where the affordability is being produced. And then to the right of that is a density analysis that shows density in race. And so in that picture, the orange color are Hispanic families and the blue colors are white families. And so you can see very clearly that the lower density areas in Santa Fe correlate with whiteness, wealth, and older age. And that's something that we need to confront as a community and understand that we've basically told huge swaths of the city that they do not need to help participate in solving our housing crisis. And certain areas have to bear the entire brunt of solving our housing crises, mostly in the southwest sector of the city. I would also circle back to something that was mentioned earlier, which is that one of the unintended consequences of inclusionary zoning is needing economies of scale to make providing affordable housing financially feasible. And that has pushed growth and development to the edge of the city, which has also pushed affordable housing to the edge of the city, which has had the practical effect of overcrowding our schools, segregating our city around race, age, and income. And so these are all things that we need to look at as we sort of dive deeper into ideas around long-term growth planning, housing equity, equal distribution of affordable housing, really thinking how we make sure that every part of our city chips into solving our housing crisis. So again, this is how zoning works as a piece of this, right? So we have exclusionary zoning. So that's low density zoning, R5 or lower, 5 units per acre or lower. That's the vast majority of our residential land, as Alexandra pointed out. Then we have overlays, right? Which even if maybe you're zone dense enough to be able to do reasonably priced housing, things like historic overlays and highway corridor protection overlays suppress that zoning. So it's a type of down zoning. Then we have things like use permitting, right? Some of our denser areas in the city, more denser zoned areas of the city require special use permit hearings to achieve full zoning density. So creating subjective processes where neighborhoods can thwart the underlying zoning, right? And then again, this drives growth to certain areas of the city. One of the big ones, a lot of folks in my conversations in the community around housing say, gosh, these big these big apartment complexes don't feel right for our community. And the reality is, it's a law of unintended consequences that's where we are, because we don't allow other types of multifamily development, right? We don't allow triplexes in residential neighborhoods. So ideas like gentle density can't happen. And so we push development into commercial areas, which very high cost land, which requires very large economies of scale to make it financially feasible, right? So a lot of what we see are unintended consequences of our code environment. So here's just the quick breakdown. Alexandra touches on this, and I'll just sort of leave it at this, but like about 14% of our residential land is zoned dense enough for affordable homeownership developments, right? And less than 5% or around 5% of our residential land is zoned dense enough for affordable rental developments prior to the pandemic, which is a big caveat there. And so we're trying to solve this giant problem with very little land. And that's why you see so many rezonings. That's why, that is the mechanism by which we try and solve these problems when we don't have enough resources. But we're not being given the raw tools to solve these problems in a constructive way as it's currently set up. So what are some ideas around ways we could approach zoning differently? So one of the biggest ones, and I think that this is a priority for the land use department, and it sounds like there's money being set aside in the budget for this, but growth planning. We are probably 5 years past when we needed to start working on the affordability issues. We're like over the waterfall, we're trying to claw our way back, and it's gonna need dramatic stuff. We have a 10-year window of responding to climate change and basically getting to net zero energy development, right? And so these are like super, super urgent things we need to do. And we need to get away from the unintended consequences growth planning that we're doing now, which is like, oh, this one piece of land next to Home Depot is where you can stick a bunch of apartments that no one's going to complain about that meet zoning density. And, we're doing this all wrong. We're not looking at what we really need to do, which is like update our future land use map and identify areas for denser infill that are based on our social and physical infrastructure. So like, where are schools that aren't full enough? Where are there lots of parks and open spaces? Where are there plenty of roads to handle traffic? Where are there, the landscape of coming to community consensus about where we do this denser development. We haven't done that. And so you guys try and solve these problems in individual hearings about projects where we can't answer these questions in that context, and everyone's left disappointed, right? So like, that's a big one. We really need to figure out how to identify where we can do denser infill. The question isn't if we do it, we have to do it. We have to do it in a way that preserves our character as a town, but also responds to housing equity and climate issues that are just really, really, again, years late responding to. The other one is gentle density. So thinking about how do all areas of the city support new housing, right? So ideas like liberalizing accessory dwelling units. We took a big step towards that in June of 2019. We could go further. We could loosen setback requirements. We could loosen height requirements. That would be a big step. Looking at things like allowing for triplexes in single family zone neighborhoods, right? You could have neighborhood level rental units, right? That currently aren't allowed. The only ones that exist are in older neighborhoods. Like, we can't build the best neighborhoods in Santa Fe. We can't recreate in our current zoning, right? Multifamily design guidelines are another big one, right? Because we force multifamily development into commercial areas, it's subject to commercial design code, which gave us target with fake vega ends. So it's like not unsurprising that our apartments aren't always the most visually interesting. We had to get a variance to build Seiler Yard the way that we did because we couldn't meet the commercial design codes. And then look at exclusionary zoning policies, look at impediments to affordability built into the land use context. And I'm not like saying, let's throw out historic zoning overlays. I'm not saying let's throw out low density zoning, but let's like have an honest conversation about what those impacts are in our community, what they do to our schools, what they do to economic segregation. And then let's look to expand innovative overlays like Midtown Link, right? Like, we could extend Midtown Link up Cerrillos Road, right, to Seiler, say, and supersede the highway corridor protection overlay that currently suppresses the zoning all along our most intensely zoned strips in the city, right? In normal cities, you'd be building apartments on Cerrillos Road, right? But we have an overlay that says you can't go over a certain height, makes it financially infeasible to do, right? So look at some ways to do more focused, innovative land use stuff in more areas of the city, and hopefully lead to more infill in parking lots, those types of things that have less impact on existing neighborhoods and still provide the housing that we need. The other thing that I would like really encourage you as a quasi judicial body to think about, and something I thought about a lot as a member of the Board of Adjustment, is that like, what are the inequities in our land use processes anyway, right? Like I say this jokingly, but I don't really mean it as a joke. It's like our local government processes, our public hearing processes, they're really designed in the 1600s to benefit white male landowners, and they still really work well at that. And so we need to remember who we're seeing in hearing rooms aren't the big picture, right? And it's not your job as a quasi-judicial body to defend the people who show up in the room. It's to figure out whether something complies with our laws and codes. It's an equality issue under land use, right? Your job isn't to protect neighborhoods any more than the code provides for protecting those neighborhoods. And I think that's where we get cross purposes a lot. Even Vice Chair Hogan's comment a little bit earlier, right? Like, have we built enough housing? Should we be approving it? That's not a planning commission question. It's not your job to decide whether or not we need more housing. It's your job to decide whether or not a project meets the land use code requirements. And that's a really important thing, I think, to remember. But like, we have a lot of problems with our way our land use processes work, right? Like the E&N system, I think, creates a very adversarial process where it's really hard to come to sort of collaborative solutions around growth and development that benefit everyone, right? You know, the people who are housing insecure have more barriers to participation than folks who, you know, former city councilor Chris Moore put it this way: Santa Fe is a free timeocracy, right? And we have a lot of people who can participate because they have the luxury of participating. It's maybe a little better with Zoom meetings now, but there's a lot of working families with small children that can't do this. I'm not having dinner with my daughter right now, right? Like, that's a real thing. So thinking about that, who's in the room, who's not, does everyone have equal access to participation? Differential motivation, right? People who perceive negative impact and get scary letters in the mail mandated by the city have a higher motivation to show up than someone who maybe hypothetically might benefit from lower future housing costs, or maybe might get an affordable unit in a project. But the idea that they should have to show up, out themselves as low income and need housing assistance in front of, you know, appointed bodies such as yourself to be heard and understood as a valued stakeholder in the process is really unequal and not fair. The other big things that we need to think about is that, like, while you may see 20 or 30 or 40 people show up at a hearing room around a specific project, there are tens of thousands of people who have silently voted yes by not showing up. And I know this from talking to my friends when I'm like, hey, you support this, you should show up at this meeting. And they're like, why? I support it. I don't need to go, right? But we just assume and legislate around people who show up. And those are the people that have the negative driven motivations to show up. We do mandatory notification of the immediate neighbors of a project, but we don't go and ask people who are underhoused, who are paying high rents. We don't ask them if they want to go live in that neighborhood, right? We don't create, and some communities do, right? There are communities that have offices of neighborhood outreach that go out, well, there's a development coming to your neighborhood. They go door to door and ask everyone, rather than let the neighborhood association speak for them. That's a whole nother thing that I'll talk about at some point, but like our neighborhood association system is very broken in Santa Fe. It's sort of represented as a piece of neighborhood democracy, but they tend to have a very specific viewpoint and propagate that viewpoint. I've been represented by neighborhood associations at meetings that I didn't even know existed as a homeowner for 10 years, right? And no democratic decision-making process is involved there. Like, why are you opposed to this project? Well, we were opposed to the last project, so I just assume we're opposed to this one too. So like, thinking about how we make neighborhood associations more locuses of neighborhood democracy and conversation rather than an ideological viewpoint around no growth. And we really need to just like stop rewarding counterfactual arguments. We hear it all the time. Oh, traffic. Oh, the infrastructure can't handle it. The sewer lines aren't big enough. I've heard it all, right, in nearly 20 years of doing this and hundreds of public hearings. I have like PTSD around this stuff. Go sit at the intersection of San Ysidro and Zafrano Drive in the middle of 500 units of multifamily housing and show me the crush of traffic that comes out of those complexes at 9 in the morning or 5 at night. It's just not a real thing. It's incremental. Seiler Yard's traffic study was 60 peak hour trips morning and night on a road that handles 8,000 cars currently, right, a day. And we just need to stop rewarding these counterfactual arguments by lowering density, increasing parking, these types of things that really actually hurt affordability. And then the last one that I just pointed out, it's like your role is quasi-judicial. Your land use code is how we create equality amongst landowners. And if we allow subjective opinions about growth and development, about protecting neighborhoods, things like that, that aren't baked into our code, we get highly differential benefits for projects from project to project. And that's why we have so much growth and development on the south side where there's no neighbors to complain. And we have almost no affordable housing and infill in the urban core of the city. So what are ways to try and solve the community involvement problems? So things like facilitated planning processes are an example, right? In Albuquerque, in big redevelopment projects, they actually assign planners to work between developers and communities to like create positive solutions. They don't duke it out in an ENN. Proactive outreach, we really need to get to doing this. Like if we've got a contentious large-scale infill project, something like a Zia station, we need to send people out to survey those neighborhoods and get an objective opinion, because the people with the loudest voices are going to show up and going to get heard, and there's a bunch of people that don't get heard, right, in that process. I think we should update our ENN processes to be more based on a community impact analysis model and a more facilitated model. Right now, we make projects do a neighborhood meeting before they've ever applied to the city. And so there's an apple and oranges conversation, a head-to-head sort of us versus them conversation that starts before something's ever a city project and before the city can comment on it. And we really need to look like, this is something that I think actually like a lot of neighborhood activists would agree with too, is like, we could do better at the ENN system, right? And I think we need to like really do the hard work around this one. I would love to see a community impact analysis in the ENN process that says, this project is an 8 out of 10 on affordability, a 10 out of 10 on environmental sustainability, an 8 out of 10 on economic development. And these are the things in this land use process that are, what are the type of things that we can and can't legally change about this project to make it better, right? And then update the guidelines for neighborhood associations, right? Like, when I do a housing development, I have to notify everyone within 300 feet. I have to send things to neighborhood associations, but neighborhood associations don't have any requirement under city rules for recognition to have a democratic process for even making decisions whether they support or don't support a project. We have rules about their formation, which just say reasonable noticing, which can include flyering telephone poles, right? But there's nothing in there that says like, to make a decision to support or not support an infill project, you have to hold a meeting and you have to have a vote and you have to have evidence of that, right? We could do things like that that will actually get neighborhoods actually talking more, which I think would lead us to more complex conversations around this stuff. So I think that's a really, really big one. So the other things that I think about a lot are this unintended consequences stuff. So one of the things, a big one that hurt me personally on a bunch of levels was the denial of the El Rio project in 2016. That was going to be a really good housing project, an innovative housing project built by local developers with affordable housing. At the time I said, if we don't build this housing right here, right now, it's going to get built further down the road. It's going to generate twice as much traffic. It's going to create infrastructure strain. It's going to do all this stuff. And sure enough, it's happened. The apartments are being built next to, El Camino Real Academy right now. twice as far down the road. And that project shrunk to 128 units from just over 300 units. It has no affordable housing. It's less energy efficient. And like, who won there, right? Like, the irony to me was the neighborhood association that opposed it was from an affordable housing complex from a nonprofit I used to work at that literally had the same arguments about their neighborhood. They just weren't there yet, right? Like, someone literally said, I walk my dog there. You shouldn't be able to build housing there, right? And that's later, it's those same people that then show up to stop the next housing. We've got to figure out how to break that cycle. We've got to consider site requirements and off-site improvements and their impacts to affordability. Parking, our parking code is from the 80s. It is like wild. Have you ever seen a full parking lot in a commercial facility in Santa Fe? No. They're expensive to build. And when you ask for more parking, you replace housing. There's no two ways about it. A parking stall costs about $8,000, by the way, maybe 10. So every parking space, keep that in mind. That's the scale of money we're talking about, right? Things like water retention, right? Like when we were doing Seiler Yard, they wanted more water retention than we could feasibly do on the site, right? And someone was like, well, just do underground storage, right? It's like, I checked the quotes, it's like $500,000, right? Like, these things have huge cost impacts. And then things like, open space, right? Everyone complains about all the little parks around town full of weeds and not being maintained. We could move to like a macro parks plan that makes sure we have equitable open space around the city and does things like collect fees in lieu instead of little pocket parks in 20-unit subdivisions that don't really benefit anyone, and then get a housing unit or two more out of those developments. So thinking about more comprehensive planning around that. And then, as was brought up before, the infrastructure liability of sprawl is a huge issue for me. We watch Pulte Homes building roads and sewer lines and all this stuff out to the edge of town. No one thinks about the fact that we own those. And we own them long-term. We own their maintenance. We own their upkeep. We own that repaving. It costs, a few $100,000 to repave a couple hundred feet of two-lane street. And this is going to add up if we don't start densifying and really thinking about, the impacts on the future. So I covered a lot of ground. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
Daniel, thank you. I think what we'll do is, if you can stick around, and we're gonna let Carlos present and see if there's, and then after his presentation, we'll get questions from the commission.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Carlos?
How do I start?
Good evening, Chair Gutierrez and Planning Commission. Let me pull up this. I missed the memo about a bio, but I am a current renter. I think probably one of the few on this call. After many different difficulties trying to rent in Santa Fe, we're now trying to buy a home, and I can tell you firsthand that it's very difficult to find housing options in Santa Fe. And so I might end up like some of the majority of our workforce that has to commute into Santa Fe. So we know that the costs of insufficient housing are great. When we look at commuting costs from Rio Rancho or Albuquerque, Las Vegas, you're looking at $5,000 to $7,000 per person. When you're looking at lost revenue to the city economy, HomeWise put together a study that it was $306 million in lost revenue to the city economy. That was back in 2007. Quite old numbers there. Economic, as many business owners will tell you, that some of the hardest parts about growing business is finding employees that can actually stay and locate in Santa Fe. There's also environmental costs. We see huge amounts of environmental costs from commuting, from a resource-intensive transportation practices, from sprawling development patterns, using up natural land. And there's been a lot of conversation, I think, already tonight about some of the social costs, about disconnected families, about children who can't afford to stay in their community, who are moving out to other areas. And so we see a lot of also disconnected social inequities. So the segregation of our community based on race and income levels. When we think about affordable housing, I like to think about a goal as being accessible, equitable, stable, inclusive, and achievable affordable housing. And there's a lot of different strategies that we could start to use to tackle this issue. It's not a one size fits all. It's not, a single option is what we have to do. I like to think about it as a spectrum between some of the individual needs and more of the systematic change. And you could lay out different types of strategies across that spectrum. To keep this talk a little bit more focused, land use is more focused on some of the middle and long-term strategic strategies. And so that's what I'll talk about tonight. At its simplest, distillation, land use regulation is the regulation of housing supply and also function and form. So we're always looking at how much housing is being built, where that's going, what the aesthetics are, how that's integrating into the community. Right now, we think about an adequate housing supply. We've got lots of happy faces, lots of happy households, and lots of homes. In Santa Fe, however, and I do want to point out kind of at the bottom here, there's always going to be a need for the non-market subsidies. We're always going to have that. And that's where a lot of the nonprofits, that's where the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is coming in. And those are absolutely essential, even in a properly working market. In Santa Fe, though, we do see that there is shortages across the spectrum. We're seeing shortages at the luxury level. We're seeing shortages throughout all of the different income levels. Right off the bat, when we see housing shortage, that's an exclusion of families. And so it's an exclusion of the majority of our workforce. It's an exclusion of anyone who can't really afford to participate in the market that we have. We also see that, I'm sorry, my slideshow is just failed. Let me pull up this other one here. All right, can you see that again? Okay, let me go back through this. So we have exclusion from the housing shortage. We also see displacement, where higher income households can displace lower income households. We're all very familiar with this. We hear this all the time from the community. And this has cascading effects of different types of displacement. And overall, then we see inflated housing costs. So Daniel was talking about how average housing costs within Santa Fe, we're looking around $500,000. In the county, it's even worse. This is a difficulty for people to afford what should be regular, moderately priced housing units. The result of this is that we have an exclusion from the marketplace, we have displacement of individuals from their communities, and that we see inflated housing costs. Again, just trying to distill this, I like to look at happy faces and sad faces, and there's a lot of sad faces in how the market is working. That we do not have a healthy housing marketplace in Santa Fe. So the land use code right now is intended to maximize community welfare of existing residents. And this is a good thing. This is a really, really good thing. The hard part is that it minimizes the negative effects of new development or of new residents. And so the result, the unintended result, is that we end up with very expensive regulations on new development, that we have inequitable regulations, that we have a very costly and cumbersome approval process. The land use code that we have encourages developers to build as expensive as possible rather than as affordably as possible. And overall, this is, again, like I was saying before, a lack of adequate affordable housing and an unhealthy housing ecosystem. An example, let's say that a developer right now is trying to build a duplex at some affordable rate. The lending requirements might say something like a 7% return. That's not something that we could change. And so we do have hard numbers that are these larger baked in numbers that we have to comply with. Within that, we use the land use code And all the different things that we're adding with the land use code are adding costs. This isn't always a bad thing, but we do have to acknowledge those are adding costs. Also through different types of community development processes and through the approval processes, the entitlement processes, it's also adding costs. And so every time that we're asking for more open space, more parking, more vegetation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, those aren't necessarily bad things, but it does add cost. And across the board, we'll see less units priced higher than they otherwise would be. And that's an unfortunate result of some of our land use practices. There's been some talk about sprawl. You could think about it as neighborhood protection, as greenfield development, but it definitely does push development out towards the fringes of town where there's less of those development pressures. This creates exclusive zones. And so, so Daniel and Alex were both talking about a huge amount of existing area that is very difficult to redevelop. It's very expensive to redevelop, or infill sometimes vacant land, but it's very expensive to develop. So all those difficulties make it harder to develop in existing infill areas, and it pushes development out. And as we've seen before, this does create higher development costs for the developer, which are then passed on to the residents, but they are city liabilities. And so all of the infrastructure, all of the roads, all of the water lines, all of the parks, all of those things become city liabilities that we have to maintain. Many senior city staff will tell you that a lot of the roads, a lot of the parks, a lot of the medians, the water lines, all of that infrastructure, we don't actually have a way to really pay for the long-term life cycle costs. So these are burdens that the city is being saddled with. It also creates higher resident transportation costs. So there's lots of nonprofits. Chainbreaker is a very notable one that communicates a lot around looking at the whole cost of living. And when you're spending $5,000, $15,000 commuting in from Santa Fe, it's not always affordable looking at the whole cost of living. And so we have to consider those things. What this comes down to is values. And a lot of this, it's not the job of city staff like myself to tell the community what the values are. We try to work with whatever those values that we've gotten. Exactly as Daniel was saying, right now, because there's an unclear understanding of values, that ends up being debates at the ENN process, ends up being debates at the Planning Commission process, that ends up being debates for city staff with existing regulations that are really difficult to actually get beyond. This gets into some of the comprehensive equity, land use, and urban planning practices that we'll need to engage in at some point in time in Santa Fe. It's important to note, though, that values can conflict, and values require different types of balancing and trade-offs. There's different priorities. What we've seen in the past, so 25 years ago was the last time that the city of Santa Fe really did a more comprehensive and general planning processes, looking at the values of the community. And one of the top priorities at that time was affordable housing and the cost of living. But we didn't prioritize how the different values worked. And so one of the highest concerns of the community was uncontrolled growth and development, loss of tradition and culture, environmental and open space degradation, and traffic congestion and parking. And so if we're to extrapolate these, I kind of see these four items as an opposition to large projects, an opposition to tall projects, an opposition to dense projects, and an opposition to projects with lots of people. And again, it is absolutely not my job to tell a community what the values should be, but we need to be able to reconcile how those values work. Another example, in 2007, there was a Santa Fe downtown vision plan that said that housing was a value. It is a value in the historic districts. It is a value downtown. But we also want to make sure we have more community uses. We also want more parking. We also want more open space. We also want less height. We also want less massing. And this image over to the right is showing that In this plan, we're identifying that housing is a value, but not as important of a value as the preservation of historic or architectural character. And from this drawing, it kind of creates the sense that we could have more housing as long as it's invisible. And that's an example of where, if we're not prioritizing different values, everyone's going to be unhappy because we're never able to get those. And so what we have to do is we have to be able to reconcile and we have to be able to balance. And where that is a hard thing to work with. That requires community outreach, that requires discussions, that requires facilitative leadership. Is how do we balance the fact that Santa Fe does not have enough housing, that despite all of our strategies in the past 25 years, the housing problem has gotten worse, and that if we want more affordable housing, we need more housing. And that comes into direct conflict with the opposition to different types of projects. That comes into conflict with views. And so again, it's not all or nothing, but it's trying to figure out what the correct balance is. Some questions that have to be answered, and again, these are not questions that staff can answer. These are questions that have to come from a community. These are also not questions that we could answer on specific projects. These are broad, long-term questions about values of the community. Is how do we think about the different values? How do we prioritize them? How do we strategize them? And how do they affect and relate each other? This is understanding how the built environment works, the complexities of the built environment. What are the priorities that we have? Starting to rank those. What are we willing to give up? What kind of discomforts are we willing to accept in order to have different types of priorities? And how can we be flexible? And so these are, this approach is the long-term comprehensive facilitative planning processes. Because of where we're at with capacity right now, what I've tried to do a little bit with the Planning Commission Working Group is instead to focus more on this mid-level. Rather than looking at comprehensive equity planning, more just thinking about how can we include affordable housing into market rate developments, and how can we improve the housing ecosystem. And so what we are looking at here, so here's again the housing shortage kind of displayed out. When we have this housing shortage, the strategies that we could use to increase affordable housing at the very top end of the market is simply to allow more market rate development. That's not something we have to incentivize. That's not something we have to encourage. It's just allowing market rate development. We do have a shortage there. At some of the middle levels, it's allowing efficient land use. And it's just thinking about how can we get more efficient land use out of our existing land to make that middle end of the market more affordable for median income populations. Towards the lower end of the spectrum, we definitely do need to be figuring out ways that we could provide incentives and subsidies. And so this goes back to some of the nonprofits. We do not have enough resources to satisfy the entire lower end of the demand with subsidized housing. We have not been able to create that. We could definitely increase the subsidies that we give. We could increase the resources that we have, but we'll still need to have land use incentives and subsidies so that market rate developers are more encouraged to actually start building some of these products. So what we've done is somewhat try to take a targeted land use approach. How can we increase affordable housing supply, and how can we allow more efficient land use practices? I've met with Planning Commission Working Group and had preliminary discussions with many different stakeholders, many different nonprofits that have been working in the community. And where we're at so far is that we can amend the land use code in strategic and targeted ways that allow more housing, and so create more of that natural affordability. We could streamline some of the approval processes for small projects. We could look at flexible design and efficiency. So that's thinking about increased height, increased lot coverage, decreased parking, decreased setbacks. There's a lot of different flexibility that we could have within a lot of those design guidelines. And we could also be reducing development fees and making development more directly feasible to build. That's about what I've got. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Carlos. Okay, commissioners. So first off, I would like to thank Alexandra, Daniel, and Carlos. There was a lot of great information presented tonight. It's a, set up as a question and answer evening. So I would like to turn it over to commissioners. Commissioners, I ask that we limit our questions to a couple to three so everyone has a chance to talk. The first week of daylight savings is always a tough one. So with that, I'll get started. Commissioner Faulkner, I cut you off with your hand up with Daniel. So you have the floor first.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things. I have a question for Daniel, well, for pretty much everybody who presented. If there was some way we could find funds to help with the infrastructure of some of these projects. I know when I've worked with developers, infrastructure, people do not realize how expensive excavating is, getting water into an area, electricity, all the things that you have to do to set up a development, to build housing, that all becomes very expensive. And so one of the questions I had was if we could find some funding somewhere that could help offset those costs. One of the things that I think about is the third phase of Tierra Contenta. A lot of the profit made from the Tierra Contenta arrangement goes into economic development, but not a lot of that comes back into Tierra Contenta. And so if we could find a way to use those, to find some funding somewhere to help offset the cost of getting the infrastructure put in, do you think that would help with the building of affordable housing?
Yeah, I'll tackle that. So Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Faulkner, thanks so much for the question and the opportunity to be here tonight, of course. That's a great point. So like some of the communities I've worked with in the Mountain West have different pools of funding that they use to pay for infrastructure and actually leverage things like additional affordability. And it's really an incentive-based approach versus a regulatory exaction approach that we sort of rely on heavily. And so we have probably some funding sources that could do that locally. Capital improvement funding is a great example of money that can only be spent on public infrastructure. Currently, obviously, we have huge capital needs, but even setting aside 10% of that money for affordable housing could be a couple $1 million a year that we could use to incentivize developers to deepen affordability, to be able to do new types of things. On the issue of reinvestment, it's an interesting thing you brought up. There is actually a bill moving through City Council, hopefully scheduled soon, that would dedicate half of land sales to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. As you noted, it currently all goes to economic development. So it's tying a little bit of nexus between land sales and the trust fund, which is a big thing we're working on. But yeah, I mean, we recently at the Coalition did a report that was released in January around ways that we could fund the Housing Trust Fund. And that includes some of those funding mechanisms. I would love to see an incentives-based approach around a lot of stuff, right? Like we could do that with accessory dwelling units. Like we could give incentives if you agree to accept Section 8 vouchers after you build a guest house, or, to long-term rent it. It's like at a certain point, we have to start investing in the things we want to see, rather than hoping that we can extract them from economic processes, because those have unintended consequences. And I mean, I think we see that a lot in our community.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry, Alexandra, go ahead.
No problem. Thank you. Commissioner Faulkner, I would also add that the city's done that. The city, specifically at Old Las Vegas Place, funded through CIP a chunk of the infrastructure, and then liens were put on each house so that the cost of that infrastructure was paid back to the city when the house was sold. So there's, there's a way to do it where it also doesn't have to be a complete loss of funding either. Can come back.
Okay, thank you. And then I had a couple other just points. When Daniel was presenting, when I joined the Planning Commission, one of the first things I did is started any city I went to, I looked into how they resolved some of these issues. And there are cities who were a very old city, but in a lot of ways were naive to how to deal with population growth and some other things. So when I went to Boulder and to Denver and Chicago and LA and a couple of other, Houston, Austin, I really dug into how they approach some of these issues. And one of the things that that I noted, and I keep speaking to this, is that we are putting density in places that do not have the infrastructure, nor do they have the amenities to handle the density that's being built. So density is great if it's in the right location. If it's not in a good location, density becomes very dangerous for a city, because the more dense areas of the city are the poorer areas of the city. And they're also where a lot of social injustice takes place. And so one of my concerns that I see in Santa Fe is that our NIMBY mechanism is so strong that we're literally putting density in the worst possible places to put it. In the places that are food deserts, in the places where the transit is no good, in places where there's not walkability to anything really. We're kind of putting density in suburbia, and that's the opposite of what we should be doing. So note that on the ENNs, there was some discussion about that in the presentation. One thing that I've seen other cities do, and I know that on the commission, there's several mediators. I'm a trained mediator as well, and I was trained around social injustice. And there's ways you can engage community that it does not have to be as polarizing as it is right now. And I know I've been talking to the land use director about we don't have to have formal ENNs more than X amount, but one thing that would be good is, like Daniel said, we do an ENN in kind of like the conception phase. And then the next time the community gets to know what's going on, it's after the project is filing for some other major phase. And the project may not even look the same as it did before. And I feel like that's setting up the community and the developer to have conflict. And so I think some more proactive facilitating of the ENNs and maybe having some meetings where the purpose of the meeting is to bring parties together may be helpful. So that's all I have right now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Faulkner. Mr. Burke, I think you have something to add.
Thank you very much, Chair. Also, I'd like to remind, there is a program that was set up a few years ago by the federal government called Opportunity Zones. Those are areas that have been census designated that actually have funders that will actually fund, or funding accounts that will actually fund infrastructure improvements for those areas if they built types of affordable housing and different types of targeted development. So I just wanted to put that out there. One of the other things I'd also like to say is that we are kind of an infrastructure geared type of community, in the fact that, like, if there's not infrastructure there, the burden becomes on the developer to actually bring it out to that area. And so they have to pay for that. So that adds cost to development. So one of the things we talk about is the fringe development, the things we don't want to see, because we don't want to be, we just keep expanding, which we can't because we have like limits to where we can expand, but we do try to infill. And one of the things we do try to infill is to areas that have infrastructure there, because it actually is the best place to type of infill. And so those were the things I wanted to bring up.
Just to follow up to that, Mr. Chair, if I can, you know, we have some funds in the city that are kind of what I would call fat funds. The utilities department has quite a lot of money in it. And part of what I'm trying to figure out is, is there a way we could use some of that money to then help build infrastructure in areas like phase 3 of Tierra Contenta, for example. And so I think there's opportunities before us. It's just people aren't thinking outside of the box exactly about how to move those opportunities. And so anyway, that's it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all the presenters for the time they've taken to present all of their the information that they have. I do want to go back to a statement that Ms. Ladd said during her presentation, was that we have a true affordability problem. And how do we address that? Well, inventory. And I think this was something that was brought up, and I think we discussed a lot of it when there were accessory dwelling units. The more economically, the more access to places would cause competition within the market, which then brings down the affordability and the amount that people have to pay. And so again, how do we fix that problem? What I see a lot of times is that we have the code, chapter 14, that was developed in 1990, 94, which who foresaw Santa Fe growing this big, or growing to the point where we have this issue. And so when we get these developments in front of us, and we'll just take the Zia station as an example. Now we're being asked as a commission, as a board, to tailor and make an exception. And that's happened quite a few times in my tenure here on the commission. And so challenging, I guess, whatever committees that need to be developed to take a look at chapter 14, because again, change is not an optional event. Change happens, and the better we are able to adapt to the change in our society, the more successful we'll be in the future. And you know, we have to address these things. You know, going back to a few of the comments or information that was provided by Daniel and Carlos in regards to the zoning districts and how do we change this map? That I think that's something that takes a lot longer of time. But to have to ask this commission time and time again to make this exception, and what makes the value of a project worth accepting the changes and that, so on and so forth. So back to how do you amend the land use code? We've been talking about this for the last 4 years that I've been on the commission, and it doesn't seem like there has been a whole lot of traction in that area. And then the last thing is, it seems to me as, where is the outreach to people where they can get information when they do need the help? And I think that relies a big problem in the area in terms of, okay, I want to live in Santa Fe, I can only afford this. How do I outreach to the Affordability Housing Trust Fund, or, you know, where do we get this education? And I know that HomeWise is a really good example of possibly ways that people can access that stuff. But I just kind of, my comments, I concur also with Commissioner Pilar in regards to the South Side, or just the availability of how everything is going in the city. So I think with those comments, I'll go ahead and look for. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia, and thank you for your comments. Daniel, I see your hands up, but before I get to you, let's Commissioner Setenia, let's see if he has some questions that might relate to what you have.
A quick response to Commissioner Garcia on one topic. If you,
oh, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Garcia, one thing that I'd point you to is the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition's website, which is santafehousingaction.org. There's a resource locator on that page where you can actually enter in different types of housing assistance, and it will pull up a list of all the different providers in our community. So if you're at risk of homelessness, if you're needing rental assistance, if you're trying to buy a home, that also works for people who want to support local organizations. If you want to donate money to local housing organizations, you can also sort of use that as a hack to figure out who's working on what different issues you're interested in. But I thought I would just share that because that's a helpful way and a place to point people to. I think you also bring up the big issue that's the elephant in the room of the missing middle housing, people who make too much money for subsidized housing, but don't make enough for market rate housing. And that's one of the things we tried to address with the new inclusionary zoning rules around rental housing. And so like a proposal like Zia Station that proposes to actually build rental housing, that rental housing is really targeted towards people who make too much for federally subsidized housing, but not enough for market rate housing. So we're really leaning on for-profit developers for that. And that is something that will be in front of you, hopefully, with future projects. So something to keep in mind when you see those projects come through.
Thank you, Daniel. Commissioner Setenia.
Thank you, Chair. I want to direct my first question to Carlos. And if Carlos, can you pull up your presentation, please?
How's this?
Yeah, it looks good. First, I want to geek out for like 2 seconds. You obviously have a design background. Did you put like your diagrams and all these, or is this like some pre-packaged thing?
I worked with some graphic designers, and we spent quite a few days a year ago going through different ways to think about design, color palettes, and things like that. And then I've kind of been modifying it ever since. So.
But you created the diagrams in terms of the smiley faces and the houses and all the.
Kind of. I said that I wanted some smiley faces and smiley faces, frowning faces, and families moving into homes and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, regardless, that is like the best diagramming I've seen since architecture school, and it communicated really, really well. So I just want to acknowledge and thank you for your presentation. Just the level of quality was so very impressed. Chair, that does not count as one of my questions. So here's my first question, Carlos. If you can go back to where you actually said that you were focusing, or the land use is focusing, I think it was at the very end of the presentation, where versus maybe, and I want to make sure that I got this right, like versus, doing like general plan or design, that you would focus more on right there. Instead of doing comprehensive equity land use urban planning, that you guys would target more inclusion of affordable housing, market rate developments, improve housing ecosystems through targeted projects, is how I heard it. And I just want to speak to that, but I wanted to make sure that I got that right, because I think that Lee was also speaking to this. So do I have that right based on what you said?
Chair Gutierrez and Commissioner Setenia. So I was personally focusing more on this for a specific project, looking at affordable housing incentives and land use efficiencies. Director Isaacson can probably talk more about what the long range vision is of the land use department. This was more just how I've been able to work a little bit on affordable housing.
Okay, well, one of the things I want to point out is I found it really interesting that you spent a lot of time talking about the conflict with the values of the community versus, the code, right? Or the code reflecting those values and what's needed out there to really solve what everyone has done a fantastic job is really highlighting a serious problem in our community that I don't know how well that's actually being addressed right now. I'm sure in some capacity, in many capacities it is, but I feel like there should be a lot more attention to this. And if we don't get it under control, to Mr. Werwa's point, we're either past the deadline or going into where we're about to run out of time to really make an impact on this. In terms of the values, one of the things, I don't really have a question. I want to point out in the point that you made about the values is where that actually gets legislated. If you're only bringing targeted projects to us, right, and yet the community is like not, you know, where the community stands, where you said not in my backyard kind of world, you know, no against height, no against density. I would say that the general plan and some of the current land use that we're continually having to make decisions of, and you know, given that we're a quasi-judicial body, does speak to those values. And it's interesting that you brought the point, even with your personal project that you're focusing on, maybe not necessarily where the land use is focused, but that, you know, that approach really leaves those decisions, bringing targeted projects rather than dealing with the big problem. It brings us to the Planning Commission. And then we are dealing with the quasi-judicial decisions, which actually holds us to looking to the general plan, which a lot of people, you know, maybe in government argue that that's outdated. And yet the point that you're making is a lot of those things, a lot of those corridors that restrict density actually are carried in our values that we have to make the decisions about. And, you know, and then we're being asked, to make exceptions. So I just wanted to highlight that, especially for our new members, of what we continue to you know, there's the law of the land that we're held to. There's the values that Mr. Gamora pointed to that we're really being penned against. So so my question to you, Mr. Gamora, is you know, in terms of gaps in policy, do you see that there's actually benefits to addressing the general plan, or really targeting, you know, these, you know, I mean, there's a plethora of things that are really impacting affordable housing in the general, you know, in the land use code. What do you see, given as a senior planner, what do you see as the pathway for the best pathway for to kind of match revisions, right, with the need for affordable housing, and how do we move forward with that?
Commissioner Satania and Chair Gutierrez, I think that's an excellent question. Given where we're at, we have to use the resources we have. You're absolutely correct that on a more general, systematic, and strategic perspective, we have to get back into the general plan. We have to get back into values. We have to have facilitative, community-based, equity-based planning processes. In the absence of that right now, given the documentation that we have right now, we have been trying to use our available resources to do that piecemeal, to do that targeted, to work on those projects as able. And it's not always the ideal situation, but the resources we have are not always ideal. Given that, what we have been trying to do is figure out more, where are some of the areas where we can make some of these smaller changes that will see positive influences in the affordable housing market. So for instance, we can work on a package that looks at different ways that we could incentivize affordable housing in market rate developments. We can work on those things. And so that is a strategy that we could work on in the meantime. And that's still a perfectly good strategy to be working on with the resources that we have.
Got it. So, but does that actually solve the larger problem from your perspective? And now I want to admit that I know I'm very sensitive to staff, and I know Director Isaacson probably has viewpoints as well. But and you don't have to answer these questions, because I'm not trying to pin you amongst anyone or your colleagues or your boss. But I'm really interested because I heard you on the radio the other day, and I really appreciate what you had to say about affordable housing. And I'm interested in whether you actually think that's sufficient to really deal with the problem that we're talking about tonight.
Commissioner Satania and Chair Gutierrez, if we want to make systematic changes to affordable housing, we have to make systematic changes to land use. Again, I don't decide where the community's resources are or where we should be investing our resources. And so I think it's really up to the community about how many resources do we want to focus on this issue? How important, how prioritized is this issue? And thus from that, what's staff's capability to make the changes that we can?
Got it. Thank you so much. I'll probably have some other questions if I'm allowed the time, but I actually want to direct a question to Mr. Daniel Werworth. Daniel, if you'll say something, I can get you on my screen.
Oh yeah,
there.
fire away.
Okay, great.
Was deferring.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. So, hey, Daniel, thank you for your presentation, and I really appreciate you highlighting really the question that I asked Alexandra, which are what are the impediments in the code that actually prevent us from having affordable housing, right? Not only making it affordable for the developer and incentivizing them, but also incentivizing the community, the city to be able to provide and take some of those costs so that this problem, we start to find long-term solutions. So I appreciate you pointing out those things. Now, one of the things, and again, what I was bringing with is with Mr. Gamora, is you kind of just, while you focused a lot on the details of the land use code, I don't have too many questions about that, but one of the things that you kind of skirted over and just made a general point, and I want to provide you an opportunity to elaborate, is on the general plan. You said, yes, the city is maybe working on making updates, but what difference do you see, updating or not updating, but even just making updates to the general plan would make a difference on affordable housing, and how would that work? And I know that you've sat on committees. I know that this is not an unfamiliar issue to you in terms of the general plan and its potential.
Yeah, Chair Gutierrez, Commissioner Satania, I think one of the big problems we have right now, if we think about our general plan, it was adopted in 1999. The process was started in the mid 90s. It's now, 25-year-old document. We have these layers of code that have happened in that time. I think the Zia Station conversation is a great one, an example of where, yeah, we had that overlay district put in 1986. There's a commuter rail line there that didn't exist when that was made, right? Like that is a huge change in condition. And so in lieu of not having a general plan update, we have to go through these more complex processes of what you guys refer to a lot as exceptions, but what those are actually the mechanisms that we've created to legally deal with situations like that, where situations have changed significantly since a particular piece of code was adopted. And how do we prioritize the hierarchy, sort of what Carlos was talking about, right? Where it's like, we want affordable housing and views and this and that. And general planning, growth planning, those types of things are where we do the push-pull conversations. Like we can't have it all. So how do we prioritize? Are we willing to give up a little bit of this for affordable housing? Is transit-oriented development and climate change response more important than the views of 100 homeowners or whatever that particular thing is? That's one of the big things that I think, like the conflict that you guys see in public hearings is really a lack of consensus around these general planning concepts, because like for most people, like, there are people who are 25 years old who have never been engaged in a growth planning conversation in their community, right? Like, think about that. That's kind of a wild concept, right? And so I think the general plan is a huge lift when we think about it. I would love to see an incremental approach around the general plan. I think growth planning is a great place to start. I spoke at City Council budget hearing last week saying fund the land use department to be able to do this, right? Like, it's not just fund the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, it's fund the Affordable Housing Department. It's fund the land use department to get out in front of this stuff. One of the challenges we have a hyper-regulated land use environment, right? Like, it is not physically possible for the land use department to proactively stay on top of every aspect of its code. It's so big, it's so complex. So that's one of the ways that I think we could get to more constructive conversations, is like have these community values conversations, have shared language around what these different things mean so we can have more productive conversations. And we're not trying to solve macro community problems in the context of specific development projects. The other big one is this land availability issue. We just don't have enough land zoned dense enough. And that's why you guys see rezonings. That's why you guys see these things. That's why we see overcrowded schools on the south side. That's why we see all these secondary consequences where if we do these exercises, and like the way some communities do that is to update the future land use map. Like anyone in modern times on a land use board in Santa Fe knows nothing different than seeing one item that is an update to the future land use map and one item that's a rezone, right? In a lot of communities, the future land use map already reflects those future uses. It lowers the tension around things like rezoning because it signals community intention. We don't have that. We literally are going to fight down to the tooth and nail about every rezoning because our future land use map is so out of date. And so that's where growth planning to me is the most urgent thing that we need to do. That's climate and that's affordability. And we don't have time to like be on our back foot around that any longer. I think we should start parallel processes. I think we could do things like parks planning and come up with a parks master plan. I think we could do different pieces of because we make the general plan such a heavy lift. It's high stakes. It's hugely costly. If we did it incrementally, I think we could actually grow capacity in our city departments to be able to update these chapters regularly rather than here's a giant plan, here's a new giant plan 25 years later. Well, here's a general plan where the growth plan's 5 years old. We're going to revisit that piece and update it. Here's this part. We're going to update that around transportation. You know, like create a more iterative policy document. I think one of the things that we do really wrong in Santa Fe is like pass code and think that it should just live immemorial without understanding its context. And so creating more of a living document in a general plan that can be iterative, that can be updated incrementally. But the most urgent stuff is growth planning. We've got to, like, the thing that I see in other communities that I'm worried about here is that we get into a really housing constrained situation, rents go through the roof, market rate development happens really fast. And we're doing it right now. We're adding a lot of apartments really quick and the scale's not something that a lot of people are used to. Our commercial design guidelines are pretty terrible. And so like not all the housing looks great. And we're going to end up in this pendulum swing of, you know, not building enough housing for 10 years, building a spurt of housing, having a huge backlash, clamping down, and just constantly being in these pendulum swings. And I'd love to see us get to like, how are we adding incremental density? How are we adding steady housing all the time? How are we adding 2 and 3 plexes and guest houses and apartment complexes in appropriate areas so that we don't do this big push-pull? And that's where the growth planning and general plan stuff really matters. And just getting the same language. Like I have heard the same development project called sprawl, infill, affordable housing called gentrification. Like we need to have some shared language as a community and some shared understandings to be able to have these communications effectively, especially in a city where like growth and development has systematically not benefited certain groups of people. And they're very rightly suspect of all of it. We've got to have those conversations. And that to me is a big piece of the cultural piece of this. We also have to talk about how we put a lot of eggs in our basket of like preserving architectural types as a way of preserving culture and sort of drop the ball that culture is people. And if we don't also have affordable housing, we're going to lose culture and have a bunch of like nice looking buildings with no people in them. You know, we've got to like have these difficult conversations and we've got to stop having them in the context of specific developments because it doesn't get solved. It doesn't get answered. Neighborhood people end up feeling like they don't get what they want. Affordable housing people feel disappointed because we're constantly losing density and losing affordable units and things like that. We need to take this conversation outside of the context of development and land use hearings. And that's where growth planning is really important.
Daniel, I just want to point out, you actually just answered my next question, or what was going to be my next question is whether, you know, the planning commission, again, taking what you know, Mr. Gamora pointed out about really the values against what we're trying to do with affordable housing, and where that's coming together is the Planning Commission and us having to make these decisions. And I would probably agree with you that us actually having to do that is not really a long-term solution for the problems that we're really dealing with affordable housing, and that these larger conversations engaging the community would actually best be done with updates to the general plan, whether that's growth planning or others, and actually start to move and encourage that we're modifying the land use code with a lot of the points that you raised tonight. So with that, Chair Gutierrez, I don't have any. I have more questions about gentrification and corridors and some other things, but I'll go ahead and pass for now.
Mr. Satenia, thank you. We'll see how it plays out time-wise. Secretary Clow, followed by Commissioner Chavez.
I have a question for Alexander Ladd. Alexander, you stated that the city is, I know that one of the big resources that the city has is vacant land. And, they use some of it from time to time for affordable housing. And I'm just wondering, you commented that there's plans in the works to do more of that. I mean, I think really the only way to move a lot of the affordable housing away from the south side where land is a lot less expensive to other areas of the city is the use of city land. So can you give us a little bit more information on that?
Chair Gutierrez, Secretary Clow, the city's intention is to do a disposition of city-owned land fairly quickly. We have some sites picked out. I have to say the bulk of city-owned land is undeveloped for a reason. A lot of it's taken up with easements, and some of it's just undevelopable. The best land that the city owns would probably be the land on Silo Road where Daniel's project's going. But the city hasn't done its own internal planning to figure out, is that where the future city hall is going to be built, or is it going to go at some other existing city site? But yes, absolutely. Being able to buy down the cost of land through a donation is well within what we should be doing as much as we can.
Thank you.
If I could just add to that, I just want to reinforce building affordable housing project on a city-owned piece of land. It really made us able to win a $10 million grant, right? Mm-hmm. So for a few $100,000 of city funds and a $1 million piece of land, we're able to leverage that really highly. And I actually would love to see, one of my sort of dream of dreams things is like something that like a redevelopment agency that could look at all the city-owned land, because it's not, I mean, it's the campus, it's Siler Road, it's scatter site parcels, it's the Northwest Quadrant. We could actually be really leveraging this stuff smartly and also thinking about acquiring land, because I'm actually concerned about long-term that we need to acquire land for future affordable housing. If we're going to keep diversity in our community long-term, we actually need to be thinking about maybe we acquire properties that are contentious development sites and lead facilitated planning processes around them, right? And things like that. But it's one of the best tools we have. It gives nonprofit developers like me the chance to be more competitive in statewide competitions for funding. It's one of the best strategies we have, and it would really be great to see it formalized into sort of a program, an agency that could have taxing authority, redevelopment authority, and some of those things, those more bigger city tools that we're probably getting big enough to start deploying.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, I know the federal government does this all the time. They do land swaps, with individual, with people that want other areas of land, and then they swap. So that could be looked at too, I would assume.
Yeah, huge potential there, particularly with the schools, I think is one of the areas I'd love to think about, that land swaps with the schools that could maybe be teacher-focused housing or other things like that are strategies we could do. But land availability is a big one. The cost of land is a big one. also, the act of the city identifying and donating a piece of land sort of blesses it in a way that makes affordable housing possible in some areas that might not otherwise be possible. So I think those are all important things, but really love the idea of land banking long-term, that we start thinking about now how we acquire sites for future affordable housing, because there's not infinite land, and we need to think about, future generations and how we make sure we have durable community assets around affordability.
I'm done.
Thank you, Secretary Clow. Commissioner Chavez.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Being new to the commission, I just wanted to thank Carlos and Daniel for their presentations. A lot of what you spoke about really, is a important and sensitive subject to me because I work in education and I am an advocate in the community on the South Side. And so I see firsthand the crisis that we have with affordable housing, and I see it firsthand with the children in our community. And when we talk about a problem that we want fixed, those kids are going to just follow the domino effect of lack of housing. And we're gonna be in this pit that we can't dig ourselves out of. So, I really appreciate the conversation of updating the general plan, some of the ideas and some of the, the ideas that you presented. I do get concerned when we talk about updating something that we're making decisions about for the community, is that the community has an equitable voice, because that was all built based on a certain group that were willing to speak up and willing to say what they want. And so just in hearing everything and thinking about it, we talk about these nonprofits that we are in partnership with, who are working with the groups that don't have a voice, who are kind of just caught up in their basic needs being fulfilled to just survive in the city. And I wonder if we really could capitalize on those partnerships and getting their voice heard, really letting those nonprofits know the kind of decisions or the kind of moves the city wants to make in development, so that those individuals are informed when they're going through the affordable housing process, so that they have the information to voice what they see Santa Fe to be for the future. I'm sure they have great insight, especially because they're experiencing the struggles that they have. But I really feel like we can't expect them to come to us. Like I said, I'm a community advocate. I have to go to them. They don't come to me. It's a lot of digging, it's a lot of seeking out. But the fact that we have these partnerships and they have people they trust that they can open up to, that can inform them of these processes that take place in the city, I think would make them more willing to have a voice in the process, so that we have a general plan that truly represents all of Santa Fe, especially the highly populated South Side area, which really needs to be heard at this point, I think.
Thank you, Commissioner Chavez. Anything else? Or?
No, thank you guys. I just think that the work that you put together for us tonight was amazing. Super, super informational, helpful. Definitely the right direction.
Thank you. Before I circle around, Vice Chair Hogan or Commissioner Picarello, anything for Dan or Carlos?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think it's interesting looking at the issues that affect growth in Santa Fe, in a sense, have been the same ones that have been on the table for 30 years. And it's the perennial problem that we have. The forces are the same, and we keep looking, and thankfully we are looking at different ways to approach the problems. And sometimes it requires that we be a little more bold and change the way things are and say no to those that want to close the gate. But anyway, I appreciate the presentation and your opinions on what's working and what's not. I appreciated the candor also. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's it for me.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hogan. Commissioner Picarello?
Yeah, I'll second that. I thought the presentations were wonderful, very well prepared. Thank you so much for putting a lot of work and time into them. And, I really appreciate the ideas around incremental updates to the general plan, making it an iterative process. There's just a lot of meat here, and I very much appreciate all that work. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Faulkner has her hand up, and I know Commissioner Satenia wants a little bit more time. So if you two commissioners can try and keep it to about 2 minutes so we can move on. It's 9 o'clock. I think we've had a really great session. There's a lot of things that have been learned and remembered by me, but go ahead, Commissioner Faulkner.
So one thing I would like to ask is, when it comes to matters from the commission, I think we're going to be talking about something that it would be good for Alexandra and Carlos and Daniel to stick around for if you have the patience to do so. That's all I was going to add, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Faulkner. Commissioner Satenia.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. I'm not going to ask my questions, but I would like to state the questions that I would have asked for the sake of time, just to give a sense of kind of what my final thoughts are on all this. And again, I appreciate all the presenters. But some of the questions that I had in terms of that I would love to learn more, or maybe have conversations afterwards, or just have on the record, which is really looking at, there's a lot of focus on density in corridors. And obviously that can be addressed at the city council or through long range planning or the general plan or the future land use map. All of those options have been mentioned. But one of the concerns that I have is that when you're focusing on the corridors and you're bringing density also brings gentrification. In my view, and that you're putting people in there and you're bringing more amenities, and there's more demand, and with more demand, there's more costs that go up. So I'm really interested, I would really be interested at some point to hear what the city's thoughts are, or maybe what Daniel's thoughts are about how that actually gets addressed in other cities. I'm also interested, in why is it, or at what point could we have a survey, that deals with a community survey that you're looking out, that Mr. Werwath, that the Planning Commission actually has to take into consideration? Why couldn't that, be codified? I think that would be really helpful, and for us to take into consideration for the Planning Commission, especially if that was, you had an update to the general plan that prioritized something like that. The other thing is I have serious concerns about, I think there was a comment that there's only 700 units that are, pending. And whether, while we're talking about this, has anyone done long-term analysis as whether the units that are coming our way are sufficient to actually deal with this crisis? And if they're not, it's easy for us to present general information tonight and get a sense of what that might look like. But I actually haven't heard from anyone whether that analysis has been done, whether it's sufficient, and what the solutions that are being proposed. And again, as a planning commissioner, not only are we making decisions on individual cases, but it's also stated that the second, thing that we're supposed to be doing is making policy recommendations to the governing body. So I could go all night on the questions that I would have regarding policy, things that would actually make the difference and that the Planning Commission could contribute to, versus just understanding this really complex issue and taking a lot of time to do that. So again, I thank you for the time, and thank you for everyone who presented tonight.
Thank you, Commissioner Satenia. Give me a second, guys. Sorry. Staff communications. Is there any other?
I don't think we have anything. I think some things that we'd like to share might come up during the communications from the commission. So we'll just defer to that section of the agenda.
Mr. Burke, you're good?
Yeah, and if it's okay with Director Isaacson, I might just also, this is informational, right? So I just want to make this clear that we're trying to inform you guys about different subjects that, the commission, right? The commission, that this is informational, a chance for you guys to learn about different subjects that we think are relevant to the decisions. There are policy subcommittees, ad hoc committees that are written in the code in chapter 14 that can be formed, that are actually on the books, that do make decisions for policy, that do make suggestions to the commission and to the governing body. But when we bring up stuff like this, I just want to make sure that it's kind of understood that these are more informational, right? So we're just trying to help educate the planning commission. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. I think a lot of passion plays into this from everybody, from staff, from the presenters, from the commission. So it's been years since we've had a planning session. Thank you, everybody, Carlos, Daniel, Alexandra, staff, commissioners. I'd like to keep the ball rolling on this kind of stuff. And I'm going to turn it over to matters from the commission. I'm going to bring up something with Director Isaacson, but before that, is there any other commissioners? Commissioner Satenia? Or is that an old hand?
Yeah, no, this is a new hand.
Okay.
I appreciate Mr. Burke's perspective. He always has one at the very end. What I would say is that while I appreciate it being informational, I would just point out that there's a lot of people that are interested in making policy recommendations as it's stated in chapter 14 for this body. And what I would state is that while we are familiar with those ad hoc committees, for example, the long range planning committee, they have not been active. They have not, they require additional positions by the mayor, advocacy from the land use department, and those things have not been in place to actually deal with some of these issues. And I actually, one of the other points that I wanted to leave everyone with from, the points that I made is I haven't heard anything publicly, I want to say for the record publicly, about what steps that the land use department is doing, in terms of a general plan update or updates to the general plan, or to address some of these issues that were brought up tonight. And I truly believe that we're all interested in making a huge difference in this, not just to learn about it. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Satenia. Director Isaacson or Mr. Burke, can we in the next meeting or soon thereafter that get an update for the commissioners?
Sure. Thanks, Chair Gutierrez. So Noah alluded to this in his previous comment. I mean, we do have the long range planning committee. I don't think is technically an ad hoc committee. That's actually a committee that's identified in chapter 14 that has specific requirements in terms of who sits on the committee, who appoints the membership, and the composition. So short of, and that takes involvement by the mayor and I believe ultimately approval of appointments by the governing body. And so short of getting that committee up and running again, my recommendation would be to create an ad hoc subcommittee of the Planning Commission, which is allowed in Chapter 14, around specifically questions around planning policy. We can have up to 4 members of the Planning Commission sit on that without creating issues around quorums. I would recommend that that is something we do in the immediate term, and then over time transition that group into something more formal, such as the Long Range Planning Committee. So that being said, to Commissioner Satenia's point, I'm anticipating meaningful investment this budget cycle by the city in comprehensive growth management planning. I'm also anticipating being sort of having my budget instated for land use code updates. So there was an RFP in place that was about to hit the street late March, April. We all know what happened then, and we all know why that project was not allowed to move forward, and the budget for that was clawed back to go towards the general city revenues. But that money is being added back into my budget. That is a multi-phase, multi-year effort to update the land use code, and it's around a lot of the issues that came up during the station. Right, we acknowledged the divergence from our general plan in the land use code to where we are now. The general plan sort of stayed kind of flat, stayed stuck in place in 1999, and we kept making incremental changes, and actually some pretty significant changes, I believe, in 2012 to our land use code that did not keep in pace with our sort of long range vision, values, and community principles that are contained in our general plan. And so what we need to do is we need to engage in our robust community planning process around issues of growth. I think Daniel spoke really eloquently about why that's so important and why that's so important right now, and the advantages of doing that type of work right now. And then using our land use code as a tool to implement those policies and recommendations of our growth management plan to bring our land use code up to date, to really see that the ideas of that planning document put into place and implemented in future development, so that when things do come to the planning commission, you guys have the right set of policies to base decisions that make sense on what's right for our community now. And so that is a much longer multi-phase project. These projects that's just the way they are. But that's a project that will involve quite a bit of community involvement and will come to this group, either subcommittees or the full planning commission, for input, feedback, and guidance on what we will eventually forward on to the governing body for adoption as a new set of planning policies for the city. So I hope that makes sense. I know that there's frustration on the commission right now that we haven't been able to make more progress in these areas sooner. We really were poised to jump into this work this time last year and just couldn't for all the obvious reasons. But I do have every indication from our leadership now that we are serious about getting these programs up and running again in this next budget cycle. So with that being said, again, I think our most immediate term strategy would be to create an ad hoc planning policy committee to talk about things, that Carlos has been working on around changes to Chapter 14 around affordable housing and other things, and then also sort of serve in some ways as a steering committee for the planning department and others as we get involved in these more long-range, big picture planning efforts in the coming year.
Thank you, Director Isaacson. And I think part of the reason we haven't had any of these sessions or meetings going on that you've been so busy in the last couple of years, and we know that you're bringing in a significant source of GRT taxes, keeping the city going during this pandemic. So now that it slows down a little bit, we can kind of focus on shift focus to this committee. With that being said, with this subcommittee, we can have 4 participants from the Planning Commission. 4 keeps us under a quorum. And so what I would like to do is, whoever's interested, if you'll just send an email to Mr. Burke, stating that you're interested in there, and we will get back to you and we'll get this committee started and going. Mr. Burke, I think, is out for vacation this week, and he was kind enough to join us. So if you can guys maybe get it due by next Wednesday or something, and then we can go forward and get this committee going. Okay. Commissioner Faulkner, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I just have a couple of questions. I think it'd be smart to do a light poll now to see who's interested in being on the committee, because obviously we can't exceed 5.
So just get the emails in, and if there's only 4, then we have the 4 members. And if it turns out being more than 4, then at that point, I think from staff's interpretation, it falls on the chair to appoint committee members. So we'll do that. We want to keep it under a quorum. So it can only be 4. I wish it could be more, but it can be 4 to get started. And once we do that, we can decide what days and times and what works with staff and with commission members for this committee. Anything else, Commissioner Faulkner?
No.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Clow, Secretary Clow, you with us? You guys keep moving. I'm losing you all.
We've been sitting a long time. Hard.
Okay, look, on the agenda, I think you had something about rescinding, but you're going to do that at the April 1st meeting then.
Well, I hope I think the record's clear that it'll be on the agenda for the next meeting, and that notice will be put out.
Okay, perfect. Other commissioners? Vice Chair Hogan, did you have something? Just no. Okay, not seeing any other hands. Oh, go ahead.
I did. Sorry, I just hit the wrong button. I just wanted to request being excused from the next meeting. I will be out of town and in a place where I can't participate in the meeting. So,
okay, well, we'll mark you as excused. Enjoy yourself if it's vacation.
yes, thank you.
And Daniel, take good care of that cute little baby that was on screen for a few seconds there. We appreciate everybody's time. Seeing no more hands, we'll be adjourned. Thank you, guys. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you. Good night.